Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir, then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir, then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Oh, work it out. You work it out for Mother Lisa. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir, then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir, then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out.
All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos. And today we're going to be talking about Yuri Bezmenov, a KGB defector you guys have probably have heard of. And the second half of this stream, we're actually going to be watching his famous interview laying out the communist Marxist infiltration of public media and education in the United States. But before we do that, we're going to be discussing a little bit about who Bezmenov was. I have an interesting article actually from the CBC News, so Canadian Broadcasting Company, in which talks about the interesting relationship Yuri Bezmenov had with Canadian intelligence. Um, and we're going to be bringing a little bit of skepticism to Bezmenov, not in the sense that he doesn't say things we don't agree with in regards to religion. Again, his famous pattern is demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and then normalization. And this is how Marxism and communism sort of infiltrates Western societies. And obviously, we've seen communism or Marxist leftist ideology rise here in the United States and across the Western world. But we're also going to question whether he is totally reliable or not. Jay Dyer did a stream with one of his friends. I forget it. His name was Mark Hackard. And they talked a little bit about how, whether it be Bezmenov or some of these other KGB detractors, they tend to always promote the infamous Cold War dialectics. And Bezmenov is going to be in the same boat here. Some of the stuff he talks about, again, we're definitely going to agree with in regards to his refutation of atheism and stuff like that. But he's also a major promoter of Western liberal capitalism. Again, not that there's aspects of capitalism we don't agree with, but anybody who's played Monopoly knows that capitalism ends where communism begins. And so we're going to be looking at how he was a major champion of liberalism. Jay and Mark kind of discuss maybe some sympathies with Skittles and stuff like that going on. We're not going to be focusing too much on that, but I do have the link if you guys want to check out Jay's discussion on Bezmenov with his friend Mark Hackard. I do have that link I'll share with you guys. But Mark makes the claim in that video that he was never actually a KGB agent, and he never was actually part of the sort of central core of KGB agents doing what they refer to as psychological warfare or active measures as sort of the key slogan that's often used in the KGB, active measures. And there's a guy named Jack Barsky. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was on Valuetainment with Patrick Bat David, and he argued that Yuri was a fraud. Now, the video, he doesn't really give a whole lot of details to why Yuri was a fraud, but again, the point of today's stream is just bringing up all sides. Who exactly was Yuri Bezmenov? And the article that we look at from the CBC is interesting because it highlights that Bezmenov he certainly wasn't a great father. When he defects from the KGB, he goes from India, where he was stationed as a journalist, and then he goes to Athens, Greece, under the disguise of being a sort of hippie. And then from there, he's able to negotiate some sort of terms with the West, and he is sent to Canada, where he stays there for multiple years, and eventually has a radio program. And it's due to this radio program where he's reading Russian news for the Canadian Broadcasting Company that apparently his cover is blown as Thomas Schumann, and the KGB and Russians know who he is. And that's some of the kind of interesting stuff. If you were a KGB defector and you were worried about your life and potentially being killed by the Soviet Union, getting a broadcasting job to speak on the radio does seem like something maybe you'd shy away from. And of course, once he makes his way to Los Angeles in the United States, he also then goes on a tour laying out his involvement with the KGB, their infiltration. And that's one of the interviews that we're going to be watching today, just going over it. Again, the point is not to say that we don't agree with some of his things that he's going to state. We absolutely agree with it. The point is just question the messenger, because part of his response to his defection from the KGB in Soviet Russia is really just promoting a very interesting dialectic that seems to just be reminiscent of the Cold War era. So, again, maybe he was under the aegis of his intelligence masters, because, like other KGB defectors, he immediately writes a book, starts promoting essentially the same Cold War rhetoric that's coming out of the CIA and some of our intelligence agencies. It's interesting, something to think about. But so today we're not going to necessarily be celebrating Yuri, because often in the truther circles, that's the way that it goes. They sort of celebrate Yuri Bezmenov as this hero, laying out what was going to come in the Western world. And certainly many of the things he discussed have come to fruition. But um, I think there are some really interesting question marks in regards to his real involvement with the KGB, how much he actually knew, again, how deep he was enmeshed into the active measures, psychological warfare, this type of stuff regarding communist propaganda. But we're going to discuss all that. So make sure you smash that like, guys. Smash that like. I know we started a little bit earlier today. Really appreciate everybody being here. Again, if you'd like to support the stream, please donate using the super chats on DonoChat or Streamlabs. They take a little bit less than YouTube. Or if you like to use YouTube, please use YouTube. In fact, we need to get new YouTube members. So if you're not a COTEL Crew member here on YouTube and you don't have access to these awesome emojis, get your membership today. That's another great way to help me out. And I just want to promote a few little items here before we get started. The first one being, another way that you can really help me out is become a website member, and you can join the COTEL Think Tank with a premium membership. We have a meeting this coming Wednesday where we get into a large Zoom meeting with other members, and we start bumping around ideas, kind of like these streams do. If you would like to participate in that, these are private meetings only for basically Think Tank members. Go to the website, use this link right here. I see Thomas Henderson is in the chat. He is certainly one of them. So he can let you guys in on what exactly we do in some of those meetings. He's been a long time premium member. So shout out to you, Thomas. Thank you for all your support, brother. And I'm going to be posting a new video for website members tomorrow, given my interpretation of these Jew tunnels that they found in New York at the Hasidic temple. So obviously that's a topic I personally want to stay away from on YouTube, but I'm going to be doing a full overview on that topic with sort of my detailed opinion on things that have come out regarding that. And that should be up on my website tomorrow. So if you want to get access to that, get yourself a basic $5 a month logo subscription. I'd greatly appreciate that. And you'll get access to the exclusive video library that's right here on my website. We got tons of stuff. Again, we have Brother Nathaniel's last conversation on Alex Jones, all types of stuff. What's really going on? Again, talking about maybe some theories that aren't appropriate for certain platforms. So if you would like to get access to some of that exclusive content, make sure you become a website member. Also, if anybody would like to sign up for a one-on-one session, which we got some sessions going this coming Wednesday. If you would also like to join, please do so with this link right here. Would greatly appreciate that. It's another way you can help out, and we can get into a private Zoom meeting and discuss anything that your heart desires, be it philosophy, theology, magic, setting goals, accomplishing goals, masculinity, whatever. Dating is one of the things that comes up quite a bit, is how to find a good Christian girl. So if that's something you'd be interested, sign up for a one-on-one session. And also, if you would like to sponsor a stream, you can sponsor a stream with this link right here. And that's also another great way to help me out and support the work and give me some good content for future streams. Also, if anybody's in the market and you're looking for some Orthodox stuff, go check out orthodoxdepot.com, orthodoxdepot.com, and use promo code COTEL. Promo code COTEL will get you 10% off. It'll help me out. It'll get you some good products, whether you're looking for icons, incense, prayer ropes, whatever it may be, books. Check out a good Orthodox American company, orthodoxdepot.com, and see if they have what you're looking for, and use promo code COTEL. You'll be able to help me out, get some good products, and support an Orthodox business here in the U.S. So those are a few things that are on the way. So smash that like. I now want to get into our topic today. And so let me pull up my windows. Let's see here. And so this is a really fascinating article that I was able to find right here on Yuri Bezmenov, chaos agent. Yuri Bezmenov defected from the Soviet Union to Canada in the 1970s, and his warnings about disinformation have made him a posthumous star on social media. Documents obtained by CBC News reveal his toxic relationship with Canada's intelligence services. So this was an article that I think we're going to read through before we actually watch his full interview. And this is his full interview right here that is, of course, famous and gone around the circles online. And one of the points that I think is interesting that Mark Hackman and Jay make is that the Bezmenov stuff really got going, and that's when I first watched it, was during the Trump era. So once Trump became president, and how that really played into and coincided with the sort of Russia narrative, that they influenced our election and that Trump was a puppet of Putin. Well, the whole general thesis here about the 4 stages of ideological subversion, and technically, what is this? There it is. It's called Soviet subversion of the free world press. And so that general thesis, that general narrative that the Soviet Union was infiltrating our medias and institutions, which again, it's in a way, it's a false dialectic. How many times have we seen that the same power players that are funding the West, that are funding Fortune 500 corporations, are also funding these communist experiments around the world? Because it's just two hands of the same puppet. And so just laying that out, I think that it is interesting that this video, this interview, really gets millions of views during Trump coming to ascendancy as the U.S. president. But I just wanted to highlight, again, Mark in that video with Jay, and let me share that. We're not going to watch it, but if you do want to watch this discussion that Jay does with his friend Mark Hackman, you can do so with this link right here. It's a great conversation. And he even discusses, as you can see right here, Anatoly Golitsyn right here. He was also a KGB defector and author of 2 books about a long-time deception strategy of the KGB leadership. He provided a wide range of intelligence to the CIA and the operations of most of the lines at the Helsinki and other residencies, as well as the KGB methods for recruiting and running agents. He became an American citizen in 1984. Now, again, this right here, this interview is with a gentleman. This is Patrick Bet-David, and he calls Yuri Bezmenov a fraud right here. And this is Jack Barsky. And Jack Barsky is a German-American author, IT specialist, and former sleeper agent of the KGB who spied on the United States from 1978 to 1988. Exposed after the Cold War, Barsky became a resource for U.S. counterintelligence agencies and was allowed to remain in the United States. His autobiography, Deep Undercover, was published in 2017, and he frequently speaks on his experience and as an expert on espionage. Now, he claims, and maybe we can watch a little bit of this video here. I don't know if Valuetainment's clips are going to get me flagged or not in regards to copyright. But again, he claims Yuri was a fraud based on the general thesis of the story. And Mark Hackman makes a similar case in the sense that Yuri wasn't as high up or as deep in the KGB as maybe he leads many people to believe. Now, before we discuss all that, I want to read this article here because this is really interesting. Again, the chaos agent. And so just for overview, again, this is Yuri Bezmenov, the Novosti press agency. This is where he works for during his time in India. So you'll see here, life in India, propaganda work and disillusionment. Essentially, the idea, the idea is that he is stationed in India to work as a freelance journalist when really he's actually working for the KGB, and his mission is to place Soviet propaganda into major news networks through his stories that he worked on. And then due to the repression of various dissidents within the Soviet Union, this caused Yuri to become very disillusioned with the Soviet Union, leading him in turn to find refuge in the West. This is where he defects, makes his way to Athens, gets in touch with the Western intelligence agencies, and makes his way over to Canada, where eventually he finds a wife, has children, but again, kind of an absent father, interesting character. Sounds like he had some alcoholic problems. Again, I know he's a Russian man. I know how Russians are, but yeah, interesting nonetheless. And he talks about Christianity and religion in the interview we're going to watch together, but was he ever Orthodox? I'm not sure. Now, he's coming from Russia. I'm not sure what kind of Christianity or religion he particularly was. I didn't find any concrete evidence on what exactly his religion or his spirituality consisted of. But anyways, eventually he's going to spend that time under Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, who our article is going to make some interesting points where it makes you think maybe Pierre Trudeau already had some connection with some of these communist regimes. We know, again, that the Canadian government has had to expel the conspiracy theories that Fidel Castro is actually the biological father of Justin Trudeau. Obviously, Cuba was communist, and obviously Pierre Trudeau was making multiple trips to Cuba, as photo records show. So, I don't know, interesting stuff. So, this is a CBC News article that I found. I'm going to share that with you guys as well right here. Okay. And again, just want to let you guys know, if you want to support the stream, please do so. Support the channel and all the content we put out with the super chat using the Streamlabs or Dono chat links. Both of those are in the video description, or use YouTube right here. Gift some memberships. Get your COTEL Crew memberships. Would be greatly appreciative of that. So this article talks about how he was a chaos agent. And so it has discussions with his daughter, Tanya Steinbeck. And so let's read this. Tanya Steinbeck learned early in childhood that her father's mission always came before family. When she was about 8 or 9 years old, Steinbeck's father, a Soviet defector who would sometimes leave her and her young brother alone in wooded areas of Montreal's Parc Mont-Royal to find their way home by analyzing shadows and positions of the sun. Can you imagine that? Your KGB or former KGB father who tells you this stuff will just leave you and your brother stranded in a forest in Montreal and force you to find your way home with the sun. I don't know what to think about that. Interesting. It was part of the training regimen that also included pellet gun target practice, self-defense, and early morning runs, all to harden them for the coming invasion. Quote, "My dad had us on all kinds of weird training and preparation for the Soviets," said Steinbeck, 43, who grew up in Montreal and spent about 4 years as a professional ballerina in St. Petersburg, Russia in the early 2000s. Steinbeck said her father was a harsh and intermittent presence in her life, but that he occasionally exhibited flashes of tenderness and humor. He lived with us for a few months and then didn't live with us for a few months, and then he was back, and then he was gone for a year, she said. Her father tried to stay connected, sending his children letters and postcards. Some he signed as E.T., like the alien from the famous 80s movie who crash landed on Earth and wanted to go home. Other letters he signed Papa Tom, a reference to Thomas, later spelled Tomas Schumann, the name given to him by the CIA. According to his daughter, he saw himself as a prophet. Interesting. Schuman's real name was Yuri Alexandrovich Bezmenov, the son of a senior Soviet military officer. Bezmenov defected to the U.S. in 1969 while acting as an operative in India for Soviet propaganda outlet Novosti Press Agency and conducting tasks for the KGB. He abandoned a Russian wife and infant daughter in New Delhi. In 1970, Canada took Bezmenov in as a defector as a favor to U.S. intelligence. He was hired by Radio Canada International, CBC's multilingual international service, for its Russian language division in 1972 on recommendations from the RCMP security service, according to a heavily redacted 1985 report by the Canadian Security Intelligence Services. From that moment, he arrived in Canada. Bezmenov was obsessed with a mission to warn the West that its institutions and populace were being eroded from within by a sophisticated Soviet disinformation strategy. He saw himself as a prophet, said Steinbeck, whose maiden name is Schumann. And then this is a letter he actually wrote his daughter. Dearest Tanya, here is what I think. There are no bad people. All peoples are good. Only some are better. But we have to love them all if we want to be happy. People who need people, not things, are the luckiest people in the world. Barbra Streisand, Jesus F. Christ, love E.T. It's a weird thing. Again, very blasphemous to write Jesus's name like that. I'm not sure what was going on there, but just want you guys to see it. Bezmenov died in Windsor, Ontario in 1993 in relative obscurity. His death received no coverage beyond the local daily newspaper, the Windsor Star. But his prophecies have been resurrected. Nearly 3 decades later, videos of warnings he recorded in the 1980s have been uploaded to YouTube and garnered millions of views and active comment threads reaching tens of thousands. It was during the presidency of Donald Trump that Bezmenov's recorded lectures and interviews, warnings of the Soviet disinformation threat began to surface online. The New York Times even used Bezmenov in a video series on the roots of fake news. Oh, you see? Just the way that Donald Trump became president is what Bezmenov was telling us in the 80s. See, it's the Russians. They've infiltrated our media landscape. They're filled with fake news. In 2020, Activision used snippets of his videos in a cinematic trailer for a Cold War-themed installment of the video game series called Call of Duty. Now, clips from those same videos are often repurposed to argue COVID-19 lockdowns, jibby-jab mandates are signs of looming authoritarian rule. Bezmenov also craved the type of platform his words now inhibit, said Steinbeck. He reached out, so this is his daughter. He reached out to many places to tell his story, and for the most part, people weren't interested, said Steinbeck, who lives in Oregon with her husband and 2 daughters. I think he had many failures in his career, and that was deeply disappointing for him. That frustration can be seen in more than 1,000 intelligence records from CSIS and the RCMP that have been obtained by the CBC News. Released under the Access to Information Act, these records for the first time traced the trajectory of Bezmenov's defection from the moment he landed in Canada through his tumultuous time at CBC to the fallout with the federal government over his decision to go public with his story. And so one of the interesting things, we're going to read all this, but again, if he was scared for his life, it seems interesting that his first, or it was like his second job, once getting to Canada, was to be a radio show host talking about Russian news for the CBC, of which he claims that the KGB and the Soviet Union discovered him based on just hearing his voice over air, and that we're going to see he ends up meeting a mysterious Russian figure who warns him basically that they knew who he is. And this is going to then eventually lead him to just going public with his whole story. Interesting. It seems like if you're trying to hide from the KGB, the last thing you want to do is be on the radio. But that would just be, again, my opinion, trying to think about that logically. Continuing forward here, much remains unknown about Canada's role in the Cold War, says Tim Sale, director of the International Relations Program at University of Toronto and a project leader for the Canadian Foreign Intelligence History Project. That's largely because, unlike the US and UK, the Canadian government still lacks a proper declassification framework. Alan Barnes, a former director of the Privy Council's Intelligence Assessment Secretariat, Middle East and African Division, said Canada's story is either being ignored entirely or being subsumed in the story being told by other countries. In a report released in January 2021, Federal Information Commissioner Caroline Menard called on the federal government to develop a declassification framework allowing for the release of historical documents at certain time intervals. Maynard said her office is handling about 400 complaints over historical records, which accounts for 20% of their workload. This goes back to having an open and transparent government and providing the information voluntarily. Yeah, because we all know the Canadian government is all about freedom and transparency, right? They will shut your bank account down. They will call you any name in the book. They'll arrest you for asking questions of the critical questions of the government. I don't think so, Maynard. I'm not convinced. So moving forward, the federal government launched a pilot project in October of 2021 to review a selection of classified historical records under a draft declassification framework, according to an emailed statement from the Public Safety Canada. Sales says that while it's unknown exactly how many defectors Canada took in during the Cold War, the country hosted at least 71 defectors and their families, the majority through allies, during the 1950s and into the early 60s. Canada often took in defectors from other Western countries, Sales says, as favors to allied security services because Ottawa received more intelligence than it provided to allies. Most defectors came from the Soviet bloc, but also from Cuba, allowing the 1959 following the 1959 revolution, of which we know Pierre. He made multiple trips to see Castro. Sales said the trail of communist defectors to Canada largely goes cold beyond 1962. The records obtained by CBC News about Bezmenov, however, provide a glimpse into the shadows of the post-1962 era. And so here is Bezmenov on the right, and this is him at the Institute of Oriental Languages in Moscow. So again, he must have been able to speak multiple languages within India. I assume Hindi, maybe Punjabi. I'm not sure exactly what languages he spoke. Okay. The only parts about Bezmenov's defection that were previously known came from his own telling. First to Canadian reporters in the late 70s and later in speeches in the U.S. in the 80s, along with a short book and an independently produced documentary-style interview. As Bezmenov explained it, the Americans initially ignored his attempt to defect in India, so he disguised himself as a hippie to avoid capture by the KGB. The CIA eventually took him in, debriefing him in Athens, Greece, for 6 months. He said he brought microfilm photos taped all around his body when he defected to the Americans, said Tessie Lucena, Steinbach's mother, who married Bezmenov in 1977. They divorced in 1989. The CIA asked the Canadians to take him in. The newly released intelligence records reveal Bezmenov's story from the perspective of Canadian intelligence agents. The records, many partially or completely redacted, show how his handlers, working for a secretive agency in the Department of External Affairs, struggled to keep Bezmenov from blowing his cover and witnessed his gradual deterioration. Part 3. The Canadian paper trail of Bezmenov's story began with a press report. On February 10, 1970, the Canadian mission in New Delhi sent a confidential diplomatic cable, subject line Soviet defector, to missions in London, Moscow, Washington, D.C., and to headquarters in Ottawa. The cable noted that it was illegal under an Indian law at the time for diplomatic missions to offer asylum to any defector. Indian press today carried a story that 31-year-old Soviet press officer Yuri Bezmenov was missing and speculation he may be defecting to the West. along with USA and Britain as one possible source of asylum, said the cable. When approached by press that last night, we disclaimed any knowledge of a missing Russian. Now, here's a photo of Bezmenov with Guru Maharishi Mahesh right here, who was a spiritual advisor to the Beatles. While stationed for the Soviets in India, Bezmenov said the KGB was interested in Mahesh. 3 months later, on April 20th, John Starnes, the director general of the RCMP Security Service, signed off on a recommendation from Murray Sexsmith that the secretive Interdepartmental Committee on Defectors should accept Bezmenov as a favor to the Americans. According to Tim Sale's research, the committee was created in 1953 with representatives from the RCMP, External Affairs and Citizenship, and Immigration to determine which defectors should be welcomed to Canada. Sexsmith wrote that the Canadian intelligence services should be careful to avoid becoming committed to a nursemaid operation because past experience shows that this can be a tremendous headache and consumer of manpower. On June 26, 1970, a secret RCMP memo detailed Bezmenov's legend, spy parlance, for a cover backstory to hide the person's real identity. The memo included his new name, Thomas David Schumann. Here's that right there. The Secretive Intelligence Group within the Department of External Affairs, the Special Research Bureau, became Bezmenov's main point of contact once he had landed in Canada. One of the SRB's tasks, which evolved from the Joint Intelligence Bureau, originally housed under the Department of National Defense, was to interview defectors. These records show for the first time that the unit was also involved in the direct handling of defectors, according to Alan Barnes. The RCMP, for its part, expressed relief it wouldn't deal with Bezmenov directly. This force will not be involved with the problems normally encountered in cases of this nature, said the RCMP Security and Intelligence memo dated September 9, 1970. On July 16th, Bezmenov flew from West Germany on Air Canada Flight 873 to Toronto, landing at 5:35 p.m. He arrived with $500 in his pocket and met with a designated immigration official who advised him on finding a place to live, the records show. Now, this shows you how much cheaper life was back in the 80s. Or 70s and 80s. Within weeks of landing in Toronto, Bezmenov, now operating exclusively as Thomas Schumann, found a bachelor apartment on St. George Street for $125 a month. He set up an account with the Royal Bank and talked his way into a job as a copy editor at the Globe and Mail, earning $105 a week. According to a report by the SRB, the records also show that Bezmenov received about $10,000 in monthly deposits to cover lodging, food, and other expenses for the year. He eventually bought himself a Fiat 850 and often went on drives alone on the weekend. He spent his first summer working on an Ontario farm. It is difficult to make friends in a new country. Somehow I feel a kind of vacuum, Bezmenov wrote in March 29th, 1972, later to his handler. Here in Canada, people do not care for causes or social group loyalty that much. I have to learn to live just for life. It was something he could never learn. In August of 1972, Bezmenov caught his dream break at Radio Canada International, hired him for its Russian language division to broadcast into the Soviet bloc via shortwave. He moved to Montreal and began working each day at 6 a.m., scanning the overnight news and then reporting the top stories in Russian at 9 a.m. For about 8 to 10 minutes, he followed the reports with a daily discussion on topical subjects to round out the 30-minute program, according to reports. Within 2 months, he began to suspect a Soviet intelligence asset had penetrated his workplace. He was invited by a colleague, identified as Count Livan, to meet an individual whose name is redacted in the record. The meeting left Bezmenov shaken, according to a November 1972 SRB report. I can recognize the type from experience. The identified man was restless, nervous, and would not answer straight. Bezmenov told his handler, according to the SRB report. This is the report right here. The workplace troubles only got worse even after RCI gave him a full-time job, putting Bezmenov on probation for a year, which irritated him. Friction with colleagues that Bezmenov called the Levian Mafia continued to fester, leading to a blow-up that included shouting amid accusations that Bezmenov was a Russian spy, according to a March 1973 report from the SRB. So, whoa, interesting turning there, that people working with him accused him of actually being the Russian spy in the present, not a true defector. Who knows? It may well be that this may all blow over, as have so many of Schumann's tempests in a Slavic teapot, said the SRB report from July 30th, 1973. It never did blow over. That September, one of his RCI colleagues met with the RCMP and suggested Bezmenov was a Soviet spy. The informant said Bezmenov's whole story is a phony one, and that the Mounties should take a deeper look, according to a top secret September 1973 RCMP report. Bezmenov continued to sour on RCI, believing some in the Russian language sections were compromised and receiving gifts from the Soviets while promoting pro-Russian ideas on air. He believed RCI management was too concerned with not angering the Soviet Union. In December of 14th, 1974, a letter to the RCMP summarizing a meeting with Bezmenov to the SRB noted he seemed depressed and unhappy and was still feeling the effects of an alcoholic binge the week before. And unfortunately, alcohol is going to play a serious role in Bezmenov's life, especially once he leaves his wife and children in Canada and makes his way to the United States. He unfortunately was never actually able to build his business. He wanted to go on tours talking about being a defector. Again, his general thesis on the demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and normalization framework that the Soviet Union had issued to their KGB agents. But again, unfortunate for him, his alcoholism basically kept him from being somebody who could actually build their own business and take care of things. And this is, again, he's going to die a pretty lonely man, as we'll see. So Bezmenov's frustrations within RCI erupted on March 9th, 1976, when he phoned R.L. McGibbon, his handler at the SRB, with news that he was quitting RCI. He felt he was an irritant to management, and given the pressure, faced only one option: leaving. He feels he will cut down his heavy drinking once he is away from the CBC, wrote McGibbon in a letter summarizing his conversation. An RCMP memo noted management at RCI was pleased to see Bezmenov depart before he created friction between CBC and the Soviet government. Bezmenov later told Lucena a different story about his end at the Crown Corporation. In his version, the Soviet ambassador to Canada phoned then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau to complain about Bezmenov's Russian language broadcast. And Lucena here, this is his wife at the time. So again, it appears he told his wife, lied to his wife, and gave her a totally different story. Again, I don't know the truth. I'm just laying these stories out so you guys can make up your own mind. So the Soviet ambassador to Canada phones Pierre Trudeau to complain about Bezmenov's Russian language broadcast. This led to a phone call from the prime minister to CBC's president and on down the chain until Bezmenov was fired on March 9th, 1976, said Lucena. He was dismissed around 5 o'clock and was told that Mr. Trudeau wants you out from his broadcasting from CBC, said Lucena, recounting her conversation with Bezmenov around that time. Bezmenov repeated a variation of this story during a 1984 documentary. The Soviet ambassador to Canada in the mid-70s, Alexander Yakovlev, was reportedly a family friend to Trudeau, whose foreign policy approach to the Soviet Union often broke from that of the Americans. Again, I only point out because many speculate that Castro may be the biological father to Justin Trudeau, but the point of fact, Pierre Trudeau had a much softer stance towards communist regimes around the world, and this article substantiates that. RCI's Russian broadcast did rankle the Soviets. They aired their displeasure, publishing a critical piece aimed at CBC and a state newspaper that same month. Bezmenov left the public broadcaster. In the piece entitled Lies by Shortwave, Bezmenov was outed and described as a traitor to the motherland who abandoned his family. True, he had a wife and a daughter when he defected from India as a KGB agent, in pursuit of the sweet life abroad. Canadian intelligence long knew that the Soviets had pierced Bezmenov's cover. Months earlier, he had received a letter at his home postmarked Helsinki, Finland, from an Russian ex-wife, Anna, whom he had abandoned in India. Shortly after, another letter, this time postmarked Moscow, arrived at his RCI office. The RCMP conducted a handwriting analysis of the letters, concluding one author had crafted both letters, but that a second had written the address on the envelopes. This is a quote. If you haven't already done so, you might wish to alert Schuman to the possibility of further Soviet action. So this is about, again, his cover being blown. Bezmenov believed the Soviets recognized his voice on the RCI broadcast. Again, if that's the case, why would you do a radio program, Yuri? That doesn't make... Again, that's where the whole story... We're going to watch the documentary interview today. And again, there's going to be things that we certainly agree with. But as people have claimed that he really wasn't a KGB agent, again, we've seen people that worked with him in Canada accused that he was still a Russian agent. We see, again, his general outline is to promote Western liberalism, which is essentially what we have now, and is in a weird way a sort of cultural Marxism as well, despite him warning against it. So it's really, he's an interesting figure. It's really hard to put your thumb down and know exactly what's going on here. Anyways, continuing on. Bezmenov believed the Soviets recognized his voice on the RCI broadcast. And why are you on the radio, dude? Just go work a job somewhere. While Canadian intelligence acknowledged this possibility in the records, officers ultimately concluded Bezmenov was largely responsible for his own demise regarding the blowing of his cover identity, according to a 1981 memo. Intelligence officers shared early concerns that his carelessness in associations and tendency to attract undue attention undermined his cover and legend, which was wearing very thin, said an October 1973 RCMP letter to the SRB. Internally, those worries evolved into discussions on Bezmenov's potential for redefection. While Bezmenov voiced alarm that Canada would use him as a pawn in swap with the Soviets, in March 1974, the RCMP issued a top-secret memo concluding the Soviets knew Schuman was Bezmenov. If you haven't already done so, you might wish to alert Schuman to the possibility of further Soviet action, said the memo. The SRB and RCMP officials handling Bezmenov's file didn't know he regularly discussed his defection within his circle of acquaintances, including his soon-to-be wife. Yuri, you might want to keep your mouth shut, bro. Bezmenov first met Lucena in 1973 at a barbecue hosted by a neighbor whose backyard abutted his. Lucena was 28 and had only been in Montreal for a month after arriving from the Philippines to attend her brother's wedding and to start a new life. The neighbor was her brother's best man. Bezmenov often stopped by the neighbor's backyard to play guitar, sing, drink, and talk politics. He was good-looking and very smart and jolly, said Lucena, who is now 76 and still lives in Montreal. And this is Lucena right here, again, the second wife of Yuri once he moved to Canada. During those gatherings, Bezmenov would regale her with his defection tale, including how the CIA bought his name from an Austrian businessman and that he was in Canada on a mission to preach, according to Lucena. The two dated for 4 years amid countervailing pressure from Lucena's mother for them to marry and Bezmenov's handlers that he shouldn't, lest he compromise his cover. But shortly after he was outed in the Soviet press, Bezmenov shredded his cover in Canada. And April 5th, 1976, the Vancouver Sun ran a story on Bezmenov's defection written by journalist Rob Bull. Part of the story Bezmenov shared with Bull was reality-based fiction and included an account of his role with Novosti in India, but made no mention of the CIA deal with Canadian intelligence. Interesting thing to leave out. Because remember, according to official records, he sneaks out of India as a hippie, dressed as a hippie, makes his way to Athens, Greece, and then basically, I assume he probably goes to some U.S. embassy in Athens, says who he is, and then he was with the CIA for up to 6 months, debriefing them on his workings with the KGB and the Soviet Union. So he was with the CIA for 6 months before then the U.S. getting his fake identity and then contacting Canada for him to be sent there to be undercover. The story that Trudeau government in a delicate and potentially embarrassing spot, the story said Bezmenov, who is now a Canadian citizen, obtained a visa to enter the country with false papers. Federal officials quickly recognized the political danger and the implication that Bezmenov had lied on his citizenship form, according to a flurry of correspondences and memos in the wake of the report. The Interdepartmental Committee on Defectors met and crafted a public response, which became the basis of the government's question period answer, according to the records. The public response stated the government knew of Bezmenov's background and granted him a new identity on humanitarian grounds. The fallout also engulfed senior CBC management, which was shocked to discover one of their former employees was a former Soviet agent hired under a false name. And a meeting with the head of IRC, along with the chief of CBC security, the RCMP, assured them no other defectors were currently employed by CBC International Department, according to a secret June 1976 memo summarizing the meeting. In going public, Bezmenov's relationship with the intelligence service never recovered. The SRB and the RCMP gradually backed away from Bezmenov, concluding he lost all credibility or any credibility, offered nothing substantial, and was a burden of late. This is all before he comes to the U.S. and then makes those interviews and those videos which have gone viral on the internet. Canadian intelligence blamed him for embarrassing the federal government by revealing his story in the newspapers. Their reports on Bezmenov grew increasingly biting in their analysis. Schumann had deteriorated both physically and socially. Excessive drinking, noted, now separated, became transient, now works with lower-level fringe groups of little consequence, said a 1980 report from the RCMP Security Service. The precursor to CSIS. And here's a photo with his new children. This is his daughter, Steinbeck, and his son that he had with Lucena. Again, she's Filipino. So Bezmenov would try to maintain contact, phoning intelligence officers, often drunk, sometimes in anger, or pleading for help in finding a job. While he recovered brief prominence, both the Toronto Star and the Toronto Sun featured his story. His personal life fell into disarray. He moved to Toronto and found odd jobs as a night watchman for a bus company, for example, or answering phone calls for a Ukrainian lawyer who ended up firing Bezmenov after he started sleeping in the office, said Lucena. Bezmenov became involved with the Korean anti-communist unification church known as the Moonies. He was involved with the Moonies and the right-wing John Birch Society in Toronto, according to which Lucena and intelligence records. He started drinking again heavily out of depression, losing hope, said Lucena. He told me, Tessie, I did not run away from the Soviet Union to provide you a affluent life. I'm prepared to live very poor because it is hard to find a decent job and do my mission at the same time. Well, what exactly was his mission? Um, Bezmenov drifted to the U.S. in 1980 to work for a Russian language newspaper in Los Angeles. Lucina gave birth to their second child, a son named Jonathan, in 1982. She took a leave of absence from her job as a hospital laboratory technician in Montreal and moved to California to keep the family together. Bezmenov quit the newspaper to lecture across the U.S. for the John Birch Society until he decided he could do better on his own, said Lucina, but he lacked organization and business sense, and his venture failed. To avoid losing her job in Montreal, Lucina moved back to Canada with her kids. While the children grew up largely without their father, he would sometimes travel back to Montreal to see them. It was during this period that Bezmenov published a book titled A Love Letter to America and recorded an extended documentary-style interview with G. Edward Griffin, the one that we're going to watch today, a prominent U.S. conspiracy theorist who later founded the online Red Pill University, which hosts documentaries on topics such as mass hypnosis and the coup. In the documentary, Bezmenov told Griffin that the Soviet intelligence agency known as the KGB spent 85% of their resources on ideological subversion, or what may be called active measures. That's, again, what we talked about earlier, active measures. He said the aim of the program was to conquer an enemy from within by distorting perceptions of reality to the point a populace could no longer come to sensible conclusions in the interest of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. Again, don't disagree with him there. Bezmenov continued to freelance and lecture wherever and however he could, even traveling to South Africa at one point. But his options, again, can you imagine if you're scared the Soviet Union is going to kill you for being a defector? You're now publicly using your Russian name. You're publicly describing their agenda to thwart and undermine the media and education and national identity in the West. And you're taking flights to South Africa to give the same lectures and like discussions. I mean, I don't know. It just seems strange to me. But his options continued to dwindle, and by the late 1980s, he was living in the garage of a friend in Denver, Colorado. Lucina filed for divorce from Bezmenov in 1989. A year later, CSIS went in search of Bezmenov as part of a national security investigation, according to the redacted record, which contained no other details. Bezmenov found his way back to Canada in 1990, checking into a rehab center in Windsor, Ontario. The following year, he landed a job teaching a public relations course at the University of Windsor. Here you can see a little article, a little letter. It looks like a card he sent to his daughter and son in 1989. So the same year that his wife divorced him. I worked with him diligently, and he was getting back into the mainstream of life. He had a job and was seeing his children, said Jim Whelan, a Windsor resident and Bezmenov's sponsor at Alcoholics Anonymous. And finally, at one Christmas, he relapsed. Lucina said she waited all day for Bezmenov to arrive at her Montreal home on December 22nd, 1992, to pick up their children for Christmas. He showed up the next day, saying illness had delayed his travel plans. Exhausted and raw from his repeated lengthy absences over the years, Lucina said something snapped inside her. I wasn't talking to him, she said. Tanya Steinbeck, this is his oldest daughter by Lucina, who was in her teens at the time, spent most of the evening in her room, speaking on the phone with a boy crush. Her brother, Jonathan, who had developed a fear of his father due to his harshness, also stayed in his room, according to Steinbeck and Lucina. Bezmenov spent most of the evening sitting alone in the living room. As night came, Steinbeck finally emerged from her room to greet her father. He was angry and accused her of showing him disrespect. Steinbeck, who had feared Bezmenov for much of her young life, struck back, saying he'd barely been a father and that he needed to earn respect. Bezmenov responded tersely that the ball was in her court, that she had his number and address. Steinbeck said she stormed back into her room and slammed the door. It was the last time she ever spoke to him. The next morning, Christmas Eve, Bezmenov was gone before anyone else was awake. On Christmas Day, Lucina said she received a phone call. Bezmenov was in a Windsor hospital. They took the train from Montreal to Windsor. At the hospital, they found Bezmenov in a coma, hooked to a respirator, brain dead from methanol poisoning. I remember feeling terrified and guilty that I had done this to him, and also terrified that if he had woken from his coma, he would be very angry with me, said Steinbeck. I prayed in the hospital he would die. Bezmenov was unplugged and pronounced dead on January 5th. The coroner said his death was the result of a misadventure, said Lucina. An empty Windsor washer container was found in his apartment, along with a half-empty glass on the kitchen table, she said. Steinbeck said that many, many years after his death, I was able to forgive him and love him. But to this day, she and Lucina carry guilt from that last day, that final time they were with him. Had I been friendly to him, perhaps he would still be alive, said Lucina. He had a cup that was full, and I put that last drop in to make it overflow, said Steinbeck. Bezmenov is buried at the Heavenly Rest Cemetery in Windsor, Ontario. His headstone reads Thomas Schumann, August 14th, 1941 to January 5th, 1953. In loving memory, Tanya, Jonathan, and Tessie. There is no mention of Bezmenov's death in the Canadian intelligence records. His file does, however, note 3 different dates of birth: August 14th, 1941, December 11th, 1939, and 1938. Parts of Bezmenov's story remain shrouded in the shadows of the Cold War. And so, according to Wikipedia, not that that means much, it was the December 11th, 1939 is the date that they give him. So he died at 53 years old. So again, take that for what you will. At least that's just what we get there. Okay, so now we're going to get into his actual discussions. And again, guys, smash that like for everybody who's here. And again, support my work, support this YouTube channel, support all these streams. Send in a super chat using the Streamlabs or Dono chat link. I would greatly appreciate that. Again, Streamlabs and Dono chat do not take as much money, but if you want to use YouTube, please use YouTube. Get a COTEL Crew membership, give some memberships. Send some money in. You got questions, you got comments. We'll address all those as they come in. So, okay. This is the famous interview, again, we were reading about in that article. Let me plug this in. So, I'm sure many of you guys have seen it, but now with everything that's been laid out, we can watch this and maybe appreciate what exactly we agree with. Other aspects, questioning who Yuri Bezmenov was. Was he really a KGB agent? Maybe he was just a low-level guy that defected from Russia and came up with this larger story. Maybe his defection was fake and that he was actually, a Russian spy, according to his coworker. I think that seems unlikely. It is strange, though, that he worked on a radio station and that he claims that his cover was pierced because they knew his voice. Well, what are you doing on a radio station, dude? I don't know. The whole thing seems strange. So anyways, without further ado, let's go ahead and run through this. So this is the famous interview.
Our conversation is with Mr. Yuri Alexandrovich Bezmenov. Mr. Bezmenov was born in 1939 in a suburb of Moscow. He was the son of a high-ranking Soviet Army officer. He was educated in the elite schools inside the Soviet Union and became an expert in Indian culture and Indian languages. He had an outstanding career with Novosti, which was and still is, I should say, the press arm or the press agency of the Soviet Union. It turns out that this is also a front for the KGB. One of his interesting assignments was to brainwash foreign diplomats when they visited Moscow. And he'll tell us a little bit about how they did this and how they planted information which eventually wound up in the press of the free world. He escaped to the West in 1970 after becoming totally disgusted with the Soviet system, and he did this at great risk to his life. He certainly is one of the world's outstanding experts on the subject of Soviet propaganda and disinformation and active measures. Mr. Bezmenov, I'd like to begin by having you tell us a little bit about some of your childhood memories.
Well, the most vivid memory of my childhood was Second World War, or to be more precise, the end of the Second World War, when all of a sudden, United States, from a friendly nation, which helped us to defeat Nazism, turned overnight into a deadly enemy. And it was very shocking because all newspapers were trying to present an image of belligerent, aggressive American imperialism. Most of the things that we were taught is that United States is aggressive power, which is just about to invade our beautiful, free socialist country, that American CIA is dropping Colorado beetles on our beautiful potato fields to eliminate our crops. And each schoolboy had a picture of Colorado bug on the back page of his notebook. And we were instructed to go into collective fields to search for those little Colorado bugs. Of course, we couldn't find any, neither we could find many potatoes. And that was explained again by the encroachments of the decadent imperialist power. The anti-American paranoia, hysteria in the Soviet propaganda was to such of such a higher degree that many less skeptical people or less stubborn.
Block Party Vintage says G. Edward Griffin was always sus too. Good info about Federal Reserve though. Yeah, that's kind of my same opinion. Block Party Vintage. I'm not sure how to take G. Edward Griffin. I have a little suspicion as well, but the Federal Reserve stuff, obviously, you know, just same as Ron Paul. But thank you. Oh, we got a super chat that came in. Thank you very much to Tag Hua. Throws in $5. Says he warned only of external Soviet enemy during the Cold War, but globalists are mostly outside the Berlin Wall. Exactly, and that was my point. Tag Hua, when I did my opening for this stream, is that's the part that's really interesting to me. Is his narrative totally reinforces Cold War dialectics between the West and the Soviet Union. And so obviously what we know now, again, Jay has done great work on this, talking about the hidden hands of the banking system, the banking elites, particularly in the West, and how they funded aspects of the Mao Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, various communist revolutions around the world. And obviously communism is the end point in regards to the one world government, maybe a hybrid sign of probably like the CCP structure now. And so that's what, again, makes you think all his workings with the intelligence agencies. We know that he had handlers both in the US and in the Canadian intelligence agencies, and that his whole framework is just a championing of Western liberal democracy against communism. Now, okay, compared to those two, yeah, okay, maybe you'd pick Western liberal democracy, but liberalism has led to the same degeneracy today that he was warning us about. And so it's not that we agree, you know, because, you know, our disagreement with Yuri isn't that we're promoting atheism or Marxism. It's that the offering of the solution by him is in fact the thing that we already have that has led us to the place that we're at today. And so it's a false solution. It's a false dialectic. There's no you know, redeeming factors there. And so, and it's the same central banking hands that are behind both sides of the framework, if you know what I'm saying. So I'm totally with you there, Tag Hua. And thank you very much, brother, for the $5 super chat. I really appreciate that. And if you guys would like to support the channel and all the streams I make, please use a Dono Chat, Streamlabs, or YouTube. And if somebody's out there that's feeling generous, give some COTEL Crew memberships to the people. Would greatly appreciate that.
Would really believe that United States is just about to invade our beautiful motherland, and some secretly hope that it will come true.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Well, getting back to life inside the Soviet Union or inside communist countries in general, in this country, at the university level primarily, we read and hear that the Soviet system is different from ours, but not that different, and that there is a convergence developing between all of the systems of the.
Yeah, Natashski says, yeah, he probably just switched sides and was working for the U.S. That's what I suspect. That's my personal opinion. But again, I'm not a Bezmenov expert, but that's my general consensus, is that his defection, yeah, maybe. And I'm also skeptical about how high he was in the KGB. Some reports, again, investigators that have looked into some of the documents coming out of the fall of the Soviet Union say that he was nowhere near a high KGB agent, and he was basically just one of these lower level KGB agents that was tasked with putting propaganda in news articles. So again, who knows? Who knows the severity of how much he was involved with the Soviet Union in the first place? He may have just been a really low ranking guy. So again, I don't know for sure.
Of the world. And that really doesn't make an awful lot of difference what system you live under, because you have corruption and dishonesty and tyranny and all that sort of thing. From your personal experience, what is the difference between life under communism and life in the United States?
Well, life is obviously very much different for simple reason that the Soviet Union is a state capitalist economically. It's a state capitalism where an individual has absolutely no rights, no value. His life is nothing. It's just like an insect. He's disposable. Whereby in the United States, even the worst criminal is treated as a human being. He has a fair trial, and some of them capitalize on their crimes. They publish their memoirs in their prisons and get handsomely paid by your crazy publishers. The differences, of course, in the daily life are very various, depending on whom we are talking about. In my own private life, I never suffered from communism simply because I was brought up in a family of high-ranking military officer. Most of the doors were open for me. Most of my expenses were paid by the government, and I never had any troubles with the authorities or with the police. So in other words, I would say I enjoyed, or I had good reasons to enjoy, all the advantages of so-called socialist system. My main motivations to defect had nothing to do with affluence. It was mainly moral indignation, moral protest, rebellion against the inhuman methods of the Soviet system.
Well, specifically, what did you object to?
I objected, first of all, against oppression of my own dissidents and intellectuals. And that was the most disgusting thing that I witnessed as a young student who was brought up a very troublesome period in our history, from Stalin to Khrushchev, from total tyranny and oppression to some kind of liberalization. Second, when I started working for the Soviet embassy in India, to my horror, I discovered that we are millions times more oppressive than any colonial or imperialist power in the history of mankind. That my country brings to India not freedom, progress, and friendship between the nations, but racism, exploitation, and slavery, and of course economical inefficiency to this country. Since I fell in love with India, I developed something which by KGB standards is extremely dangerous thing. It's called split loyalty. When an agent likes a country of assignment more than his own country. I literally fell in love with this beautiful country, a country of great contrasts, but also great humility, great tolerance, and philosophical and intellectual freedoms. My ancestors used to live in caves and eat raw meat when India was a highly civilized nation.
Now, remember, this is in the 1980s. So this interview was specifically 1984. He had already been married twice. He had abandoned both families. So he was married to a woman named Anna in Russia, and she moved with him to India, and they had a baby girl. When he defected, he left her and went to Canada, where he was there for a full decade, where he met Lucina, and they had 2 children. And then he lost his job. Again, there's a lot of chaos, which we read in that opening article. And his alcoholism led him to eventually going to Los Angeles to work for another company in regards to utilizing his Russian language skills. And that's where then he wrote his book. So he's talking about how much he loves America. Well, he just got there 4 years ago, and he had been in Canada, and he'd screwed up, who knows? But anyways, let's continue.
6,000 years ago. So obviously the choice was not to the advantage of my own nation. I decided to defect and to entirely dissociate myself from that brutal regime.
Mr. Bezmenov, we've read a lot about the concentration camps and the slave labor camps under the Stalin regime. Now the general impression in America is that those things are part of the past. Are they still going on today, or what is the status?
Yes. There's no qualitative change in the Soviet concentration camp system. There are changes in numbers of prisoners. Again, this is unreliable Soviet statistics. We don't know how many political prisoners are there in the Soviet concentration camps, but we sure know from various sources that at each particular time, there are close to 25 to 30 million of Soviet citizens who are virtually kept as slaves in forced labor camp system. The size of the population of a country like Canada is serving terms as prisoners.
Incredible.
So I would say that those intellectuals who try to convince American public that concentration camp system is a thing of a past are either conscientiously misleading public opinion, or they are not very intellectual people. They're selectively blind. They lack intellectual honesty when they say that.
Well, we've spoken about the intellectuals in this country and also the intellectuals in the Soviet Union. What about down at the broad mass level? Do the people in general, the working people, the workers in general in the Soviet Union, do they support the system? Do they tolerate it? What is their attitude?
Well, average Soviet citizen, if there is such an animal, of course, does not like the system because it hurts, it kills. He may not understand the reasons. He may not have enough information or educational background to understand. But I doubt very much there are many people who are conscientiously supporting the Soviet system. There are not such people in USSR. Even those who have all the reasons to enjoy socialism, people like myself, who were a member of journalistic elite, they also hate system for different reasons, though. Not because they lack material affluence, but because they are unfree to think, they're in constant fear, duplicity, split personality. And this is the greatest tragedy for my nation.
Well, what do you think are the chances of the people actually overcoming their system or replacing it?
There is a great possibility that system will sooner or later be destroyed from within. There is a self-destructive mechanism built into any socialist or communist or fascist system, because there is lack of feedback, because the system does not rely upon loyalty of population. But until this Soviet junta is being supported by the Western so-called imperialists, that is, multinational companies, establishments, governments, and let's face it, intellectuals, so-called academia in the United States is famous for supporting the Soviet system. As long as the Soviet junta will keep on receiving credits, money, technology, grain deals, and political recognition from all these traitors of democracy or freedom, there is no hope. There is not much hope for changes in my country. And the system will not collapse by itself simply because it's being nourished by so-called American imperialism. This is the greatest paradox in history of mankind, when capitalist world supports and actively nourishes its own destructor.
I think you're trying to tell us something.
Oh, yes. I'm trying to tell you that it has to be stopped unless you want to end up in Gulag system and enjoy all the advantages of socialist equality, working for free, catching fleas on your body, sleeping on the planks of plywood in Alaska this time, I guess. That's where Americans will belong, unless they will wake up, of course, and force their government to stop aiding Soviet fascism.
Well, you told us a moment ago why you left the system. I'd like to hear the details of how you did it. It must have been a very dangerous thing.
It was not so dangerous, it was crazy. First of all, because defecting in India is virtually impossible, thanks to very strong pressure from the Soviet government.
Excuse me, you were in India on assignment at
Yes,
that time.
I was working for the Soviet embassy in New Delhi as a press officer. And defecting for a Soviet diplomat is next to impossible. It's a suicide, as I said, because a great friend Indira Gandhi pushed a law through parliament which says, and I quote, "No defector from any country has a right of political asylum in any embassy on the territory of Indian Republic," which is a masterpiece of hypocrisy. No other defector but the Soviet one needs a political asylum. So knowing that perfectly well, I planned a craziest possible way to defect. I studied counterculture in India. There were thousands of young American boys and girls with no shoes, long hair, smoking hash and marijuana, studying sometimes Indian philosophy, sometimes simply pretending that they studied. And they greatly annoyed Indian police, and they were laughing stock of Indians because obviously they were good for nothing students. I studied carefully where they congregate, what routes they travel, what language they speak, what do they smoke. And one day I simply joined a group of hippies to avoid detection of Indian police. I was dressed as a typical hippie with blue jeans, long camise shirts with all kind of nice decorations like beads, long hairs. I bought a wig because for several weeks I had to turn myself from a conservative Soviet diplomat into a very progressive American hippie. And that was the only way that I could avoid detection. It was very interesting experience, but it was necessary because from my own knowledge as a member of Soviet embassy staff, I knew that there were many cases when Soviet defectors were betrayed by Indian police. And also some Western embassies played a very dirty role in betraying the Soviet defectors. According to our information, they were some, I wouldn't call them double agents, but simply immoral people working for the United States embassy. And confiding in people like this would be a suicide. So I had to be extremely careful. I could not trust anyone. And that was the reason for such a crazy way to defect.
Well, had you been caught in the act of trying to get out, what would have happened to you?
Oh, most likely I would end up in concentration camp. Or, depending on the situation and on the whim of some bureaucrat in KGB, maybe even executed. This is normal practice. Quietly, of course, not publicly.
Okay, so he says that if the Soviet Union was to find that he defected, they would take him to a concentration camp or kill him. Again, it seems strange that his job with the CBC would to host a radio program using his false name, yes, Thomas Schumann, but he claims that his false identity was pierced due to his radio program. Well, what the hell are you doing on a radio program, dude? What happened to laying low if you're scared for your life? I mean, that one just doesn't make sense. And again, this is at 1984, so his identity had been pierced in the late 1970s. The Soviet Union already published a public article in a newspaper highlighting that Thomas Schumann was Yuri Bezmenov. And then he apparently is no longer afraid, and he goes on this speaking tour in the United States. Again, I'll let you guys come to your own conclusion. It just seems strange to me.
But that would be the end of my defection, of course.
Well, when did you finally make it to the United States?
In 1970, after about 6 months of debriefing in Athens by the CIA, and I presume FBI too, they let me go first to Germany, then to Canada. That was my decision. I had to change my identity to protect my family and my friends in USSR. And also, I was a little bit paranoid, knowing that both Soviet KGB and probably some double agents within the American system may be after me. So I wanted to settle down as far away as possible. I requested CIA to give me some kind of new identity and just let me go on my own. And I settled in Canada. I was a student. I changed many professions, from farm help and laundry truck driver to language instructor and broadcaster for Canadian Broadcasting Corporations in Montreal.
Well, have you had any threats on your life or any
Yes.
unpleasant?
In about 5 years, KGB eventually discovered that I am working for Canadian Broadcasting. See, I made a very big mistake. I started working for overseas service of CBC, which is similar to Voice of America, in Russian language. And of course, monitoring service in USSR picked up every new voice. Every new announcer they would make it a point to discover who he is. And in 5 years, sure enough, slowly but surely, they discovered that I am not Thomas Schumann, that I am Yuri Alexandrovich Bezmenov, and that I'm working for Canadian Broadcasting, and undermining beautiful détente between Canada and USSR. And the Soviet ambassador Alexander Yakovlev made it his personal effort to discredit me. He complained to Pierre Trudeau, who is known to be a little bit soft on socialism. And the management of CBC behaved in a very strange, cowardly way, unbecoming to representatives of an independent country like Canada. They listened to every suggestion that Soviet ambassador gave, and they started shameful investigation, analyzing content of my broadcasts to USSR. Sure enough, they discovered that some of my statements were probably would be offending to the Soviet Politburo. So I had to leave my job. And
now remember, in our article, this is totally called into question because let's see here, where he talks about Trudeau. Here we go. So he claimed that this story, so let me find Trudeau here. Trudeau. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Pierre. Oh, there it is. So he tells this story again, as this article highlights in this interview, that it was the CBC taking the orders of the Russian ambassador to Canada, but the internal documents from the Canadian intelligence agencies that were declassified and made public shows that he was an alcoholic, that people were concerned that he himself was a Russian spy. The workplace troubles would get worse after RCI gave him a full-time job, putting him eventually on probation for a full year. This is all before the Soviet Union apparently contacted them. It may all well blow over as one of many Schumann's tempests in a Slavic teapot. However, it never did. So this article insinuates that this story that he just laid out was actually a cover story. And it wasn't that the Russian ambassador told them to take him down, that Pierre Trudeau was behind the whole thing. It was actually, according to the record, some of his own doing. So just throwing that out there, I don't know the official what happened, but I'm just throwing that out there because it's worth knowing.
And of course, subtle intimidations. They would say something like, please cross the street carefully because, traffic is very heavy in Quebec. And fortunately, I know about the psychology and the logic of activity of the KGB, and I never allowed myself to be intimidated. This is the worst thing. This is what they expect a person, a defector, to be intimidated. Once they spot that you are scared, they keep on developing that line. Mm-hmm. And then eventually you either have to give up entirely and work for them, or they neutralize you. They would definitely stop all kind of political activity, which they failed to do in my case, because I was stubbornly working for the Canadian Broadcasting. And in response to their intimidations, I said that, look, this is a free country and I'm as free as you are. And I also can drive very fast. And gun control is not yet established in Canada. So I had a couple of good shotguns in my basement. So welcome to visit me someday with your Kalashnikov's machine guns. So obviously it didn't work. Intimidation didn't work. So they tried different approach, as I described. They approached on the highest level, on the level of Canadian bureaucracy.
And that level, they were
on successful. That level, they were successful. On individual level, they failed flat.
Mr. Bezmenov has brought a series of slides with him that he has taken from the Soviet Union, and I think this is a good time to take a look at the slides.
Yes.
Now, the viewers will be able to see these slides as we talk about them.
Yes, this is a collection of slides, which are, some of them are snapshots from my family album, some of them are documents which I smuggled from the Soviet embassy, and some are reproductions from local mass media. I usually show them to establish my credibility as a defector. This is a picture of my native town, Mytishi, about 20 miles north from Moscow. Characteristically, there's a statue of Comrade Lenin in the central square. This is myself at the age of 7, again, characteristically, and the statue of Comrade Stalin extending his friendly hand to peoples of the world. At that age, of course, I was still idealistically minded young communist, and I still believe that sooner or later things will go for better. But I realized that the system stinks, that something is fishy, and that ideology is fake. And the propaganda about advanced Soviet agriculture simply didn't meet the criteria of reality. If they talk about abundance of food and there's none in the stores, there must be something wrong. My father was, he's on the left here, my father was officer of the General Staff of the Soviet Army. He was inspector of land forces, Soviet troops stationed in countries like Mongolia, Cuba, East European countries. Were he alive today, most likely he would be inspecting Soviet troops in Nicaragua, Angola, and many other parts of the world. Fortunately, he died, and he didn't see the disgrace, because deep inside he was a Russian patriot. He didn't like the idea of expanding Soviet military might, especially in the areas where we were not welcome at all. Unlike many other military officers, he was reporting directly to the Minister of Defense, bypassing KGB and diplomatic service. In other words, he was a trusted military professional. And my impression that this type of people are much less hawkish and adventuristic than party bureaucrats in Kremlin. When American mass media describes Soviet military as potentially dangerous counterpart for Pentagon, I simply laugh, because I know better. I know that the most dangerous part of the Soviet power structures are not military at all. Most likely, if they come to power in my country, they'll be more sensible negotiators for nuclear disarmament and withdrawal of the Soviet troops from many parts of the world.
But if someone from the party structure or the KGB structure were to give the orders for military
they have to obey,
they
yes, because they are professional military. But you see, the triangle of power and hate in USSR is the party at the top, the party elite, the oligarchy of the party, then the military, and the KGB at the bottom. They hate each other. And the most hated triangle, the most hated corner of the triangle is the Communist Party bureaucrats. They are the most adventuristic, senile megalomaniacs. They can start war. I wouldn't be surprised. Not the military. They know what war is. At least my father did. This is the picture taken at the entrance of my Institute of Oriental Languages. It's a part of Moscow State University. I graduated in 1963. And
now, excuse me, which one were you on?
I'm on the right.
You're on the right.
And on the left is my colleague, my schoolmate, Vadim Smirnov, who later was an apparatchik in the Central Committee of the Soviet Union Communist Party.
What is an apparatchik?
It's a functionary, something like civil service in British Empire. Someone who is never fired from the service. He stays there internally. He may not be promoted too high, but he's a dependable bureaucrat who will stay forever. I studied not only languages, but also history, literature, even music. I'm on this picture, I'm trying to learn how to play Indian musical instrument. I even tried to look like an Indian when I was second year student.
Not bad, right?
Yes, actually, it was strongly encouraged by the instructors in my school, because the graduates of my school were later on employed as diplomats, foreign journalists, or spies. As every Soviet student, I was, quote unquote, volunteering for harvesting grain in Kazakhstan. This is the biggest agricultural blunder of the Soviet government. But I didn't have much choice, of course, because the communist motto borrowed from the Bible says, "Those who do not work shall not eat." And you can see me eating, therefore I was working, and you can see how happy I was about it. I went through a very extensive physical and military training, including the military games in areas, suburban areas of Moscow. And here, for example, we are on the tour in Arkhangelsk area. And by the end of my training in school, I was recruited by the KGB. This picture was taken on that day, and you can see again how happy it feels to be recruited by the KGB.
Our conversation with Yuri Alexandrovich Bezmenov, who is a defector from the Soviet Union, a former propaganda agent for Novosti and the KGB, will continue after this message.
Through very extensive physical and military training, and civil defense training too. Unlike in the United States, where civil defense is virtually non-existent, zero. In USSR, every student, whatever his major subject, has to go through very extensive 4-year military and civil defense training. You can see me here with a group of students during one of the war games near Moscow. The main idea, of course, is to prepare a huge reserve army of the USSR. Each student has to graduate as a junior lieutenant. In my case, it was administrative and military intelligence service. My first assignment was to India as a translator with the Soviet Economical Aid Group, building refinery complexes in Bihar state and Gujarat state. At that time, I was still naively, idealistically believing that what I was doing contributes to the understanding and cooperation between the nations. It took me quite a number of years to realize that what we were bringing to India was a new type of colonialism, 1,000 times more oppressive and exploitative than any colonialism or imperialism in history of mankind. But at that time, I was still hoping that, well, maybe it's not that bad, could be worse, and things may go for better. And I even tried to implement the beautiful Marxist motto, proletarians of all the countries unite. I tried to unite with a nice Indian girl, and I was fascinated by Indian culture, by the family life in this country. But obviously, Communist Party had different plans for my genes, so I had to marry this beautiful Russian girl. In the span of my career, I married 3 times. Most of these marriages were marriages of convenience on advice from the Department of Personnel. This is normal practice in USSR. When a Soviet citizen is assigned to a foreign job, he has to be married, either to keep family in USSR as hostages, or if it's a convenience marriage like mine, so that the husband and wife are virtually informers on each other to prevent defection or contamination by decadent imperialist or capitalist ideas. In my case, I hated that girl so much that the moment I landed in Moscow, we were divorced, and I married later, second time. By the end of my first assignment in India, I was promoted to the position of public relation officer. You can see me here translating a speech by a Soviet boss.
And you're on the right.
I'm on the right here, yes. And the occasion was commissioning of the refinery complex in Bihar, Barauni. Back in Moscow, I was immediately recruited by Novosti Press Agency, which is a propaganda and ideological subversion front for the KGB. 75% of the members of the Novosti are commissioned officers of the KGB. The other 25 are, like myself, co-opted agents who are assigned to specific operations. In this particular case, you can see me talking to students of Lumumba Friendship University in Moscow. This is a huge school under the direct control of the KGB and Central Committee, where future leaders of the so-called national liberation movements are being educated and selected carefully. And some of them have this, for example, is a group of students from Lumumba. They don't look like students at all. They look more like military, and that's exactly what they were. They were dispatched back to their countries to be leaders of the so-called national liberation movements, or to be translated into normal human language, leaders of international terrorist groups. Another area of activity when I was working for the Novosti was to accompany groups of so-called progressive intellectuals, writers, journalists, publishers, teachers, professors of colleges. You can see me here in Kremlin. I'm second on the left, with a group of Pakistani and Indian intellectuals. Most of them pretended they don't understand that we are actually working on behalf of the Soviet government and the KGB. They pretended that they are actually being guests, VIP intellectuals, that they are treated according to their merits and their intellectual abilities. For us, they were just a bunch of political prostitutes to be taken advantage for various propaganda operations. Therefore, you can see perfectly well the senior colleague of mine on the left doesn't really have that much respect on his face, and myself with a very skeptical smile, typical KGB sarcastic smile, anticipating another victim of ideological brainwashing.
Typical KGB smile. Now, just to give context, again, in our Chaos Agent article, which I shared, and I'll share that with you guys again, because this was a great article providing an overview of who Yuri Bezmenov might really be. The official stance of the Soviet Union when he defected was that they didn't really care that much because he was just a low-level journalist working in India. So, again, we don't know the official truth to it, but that is what they claimed, and that may give a little bit of context to this story, depending on what your personal opinion is and your belief in the validity of Yuri's story here.
This is how a typical conference in Novosti headquarters in Moscow look like. Sitting in the middle is Boris Burkov, the then director of Novosti Press Agency, high-ranking party bureaucrat in the Department of Propaganda. I'm standing next to a famous Indian poet, Sumitranandan Pant. He was famous because he was an author. He was the author of a famous poem titled Rhapsody to Lenin. That's why he was invited to USSR, and everything was paid by the Soviet government. Pay special attention to number of bottles on the table. This is one of the ways to kill the awareness or curiosity of foreign journalists. One of my functions was to keep foreign guests permanently intoxicated the moment they land at Moscow airport. I had to take them to the VIP lounge and toast to friendship and understanding between the nations of the world. Glass of vodka, then a second glass of vodka. And in no time, my guests would be feeling very happy. They would see everything in kind of pink, nice color. And that's the way I had to keep them permanently for the next 15 or 20 days. At a certain point in time, I had to withdraw alcohol from them so that some of them who are the most recruitable would feel a little bit shaky, guilty, trying to remember what they were talking last night. That's the time to approach them with all kind of nonsense, such as joint communique or statement for Soviet propaganda. That's the time they are the most flexible. And of course, what they didn't understand, they didn't realize or pretended not to realize, that myself, who was drinking together with them, was not drinking at all. I had ways to get rid of alcohol through various techniques, including special pills, which were given to me by my colleagues. But they were taking it seriously. In other words, they would consume quite large volumes of alcohol and feel quite uneasy next morning. In 1967, the KGB attached me to this magazine, Look magazine. A group of 12 people arrived to USSR from the United States to cover the 50th anniversary of October Socialist Revolution in my country. From the first page to the last page, it was a package of lies, propaganda cliché, which were presented to American readers as opinions and deductions of American journalists. Nothing could be far from truth. These were not opinions. They were not opinions at all. They were the clichés which the Soviet propaganda wants American public to think that they think. If it does make any sense at all, it sure does, because from the viewpoint of the Soviet propaganda, although there are some subtle criticism of the Soviet system, the basic message is that Russia today is a nice, functioning, efficient system supported by majority of population. That's the biggest lie. And of course, American intellectuals and journalists from Look magazine elaborated on that untruth in various different ways. They intellectualized that lie. They found all kinds of justifications for telling lies to American public.
Excuse me, it was partly your job to make sure that they got these ideas, yes, and accepted them as their own ideas.
Right. Actually, even before they arrived to USSR, and they paid astronomical sum of money for that visit, they were submitted, this Novosti Press Agency developed so-called backgrounders, 25 pages of information and opinions, which were presented to the journalists even before they bought their tickets to Moscow. They had to analyze the situation, and judging on their reaction to that backgrounder, the local Novosti representative or local Soviet diplomat in Washington, D.C. would assess whether they be given visa to USSR or not.
So but they were selected ahead of
yes,
time.
they were pre-selected very carefully, and there's not much chance for honest journalists to arrive to USSR and to stay there for 1 year and to bring this package of lies back home. This, for example, is a centerfold of the Look magazine. They presented this monument erected by Communist Party in Stalingrad as the symbol, personification of Russian military might. And they said in the article, which is published on the site, that Soviets are very proud of the victory in the Second World War. This is another big myth, a lie. No sensible people would be proud to lose 20 millions of their countrymen in a war which was started by Genoese Hitler and Comrade Stalin and paid by American multinationals. Most of the Soviet citizens look at this type of monuments with disgust and sorrow, because every family lost father, brother, sister, or child in the Second World War. Yet American journalists who were trying to appease, to please their hosts, presented this picture on the centerfold as the symbol and personification of Soviet national, they call it Russian national spirit. And it was greatest misconception and a very tragic misunderstanding. Of course, Look magazine was not distributed in USSR. The main audience was in the United States. But I presume that many Americans, millions of Americans who were reading Look magazine at that time, had absolutely wrong idea about the sentiments of my nation, about what the Soviets are proud of and what they hate. This is a group, you see the same lady with the sword in Stalingrad. This is the group of journalists. Myself is in the center with the same devilish smile. And Mr. Philip Harrington is on the extreme left there with his camera. This is the gentleman which was so deaf or so uninterested in what I had to say to him. This is the same picture, a blow up of the same picture. Many guests from various countries, in this particular case from Asia and Africa, were taken by me as a Novosti press agency employee for a tour across Siberia, for example. We would show them typical kindergarten, you see, nothing special by American standards, just nice children sitting, eating their breakfast or lunch. What they could not understand, or they pretended not to understand, that this is an exemplary kindergarten. This is not the kindergarten for average person or average family in USSR. And we maintain that illusion in their minds. You can see myself under the red spot in the middle there with the same business-like expression. I'm doing my job. That's what I'm assigned to do, and that's what I was paid to do. But deep inside, I still hope that at least some of these useful idiots would understand that what they are looking at has nothing to do with the level of affluence in my nation. This is a better picture which reflects the true spirit of the Soviet childhood. This picture was printed in a Canadian government publication by mistake. In the middle, you can see children playing on a small courtyard, and the caption goes, "This is a typical kindergarten in Siberia." What these idiots didn't understand, that it is not kindergarten at all. It is a prison for children of political prisoners. But there was not a single mentioning that what they were visiting actually was an area of concentration camps. And the job of people like myself to help them not to notice that they are actually talking to prisoners. Most of the children were dressed, especially on the occasion of the foreigners' visit. Of course, there were no corpses on the ground. There were no machine gun guards. And it looks not very pleasant, as you see. It looks dull, but obviously it does not create an impression that this is actually a prison.
Well, did any of the journalists have the curiosity to ask about prisons and that kind of thing?
Yes.
They were in Siberia.
Yes.
This is what you associate.
Some of them asked questions, and naturally we would give them, for the stupid question, we give them stupid answer. No, there are no prisons in Siberia. No, most of the people who you see are free citizens of USSR. They're very happy to be here, and they are contributing to the glory of the socialist system. Some of them pretended that they believe what I was telling them, and most of them, we may discuss it later. What are the motivations of these people? Why would they stubbornly bring lies to their own population through their own mass media? I have various answers to this. There is not a single explanation. It's a complex of explanations. It's fear, pure biological fear. They understand that they are on the territory of an enemy state, a police state. And just to save their rotten skins and their miserable jobs, their affluence back home, they would prefer to tell a lie than to ask truthful questions and report truthful information. Second, most of these schmucks were afraid to lose their jobs because, obviously, if you tell truth about my country, you will not last long as a correspondent of New York Times or Los Angeles Times. They will fire you. What kind of correspondent are you? You obviously cannot find common language with Russians if they kick you out in 20. So just by trying to be conformist to their own editorial bosses, they tried not to offend the sentiments of the Soviet administrators and people like myself. Deep inside, I hope they would insult my or offend my sentiments. Obviously, they preferred not to. Another reason, I refuse to believe it, but obviously, there is another reason. Obviously, it's a greed. These people earn a lot of money. When they come back to USA, they claim that they are experts in my country. They write books which sells 1 million copies, titled like Russians, The Truth About Russia. Most of it is
kind of like his own book. And also, again, the other KGB defector, Anatoly Glitsin, he has a famous book, New Lies for Old, which again was he made quite a bit of money off that one as well. So in a way, he's talking about himself and his own journey to the West and his hopes, again, just like doing this documentary. And as the article we read earlier, he thought he was going to make a considerable amount of money in the U.S. by going around sharing his story, which failed because, unfortunately, he was an alcoholic. So interesting.
With this lie about Russia. Yet they claim to be Sovietologists. They play back myth about my country, the propaganda cliches. Yet they stubbornly resist the word of truth. If a person like Solzhenitsyn is either defecting or kicked out of USSR, they try all their best to discredit him and to discourage him. I don't have much chance to appear on national network with a true story about my country. But a useful idiot like Hendrik Smith or Robert Kaiser, they are big heroes. They come back from USSR. They say, oh, we were talking to dissidents in Russia. Big deal. Soviet dissidents are chasing American correspondents in the streets, and they're cowardly escaping from these contacts. For some strange reason, if you want to know more about Spain, you refer to Spanish writers. If you want to learn more about French, you read French writers. Even about Antarctica, I bet you would read Penguins. Only about the Soviet Union, for some strange reason, you read Hendricks and Schmendricks and all kinds of Kissingers, because they claim that they know more about my country. They know nothing, or next to nothing, or they pretend that they know more than they actually do. I would say they are dishonest people who lack integrity and common sense and intellectual honesty. They bring back all kinds of stories like that. A kindergarten in Siberia. Omitting the most important fact, it's a prison for children of political prisoners. Another greatest example of monumental idiocy of American politicians. Edward Kennedy was in Moscow, and he thought that he is a popular, charismatic American politician who is easygoing, who can smile, dance at the wedding in Russian Palace of Marriages. What he did not understand, or maybe he pretended not to understand, that actually he was being taken for a ride. This is a staged wedding, especially to impress foreign media or useful idiots like Ed Kennedy. Most of the guests there, they had security clearance, and they were instructed what to say to foreigners. This is exactly what I was doing. You can see me in the same damn wedding palace in Moscow where Ed Kennedy was dancing here. You see, smiling. He thinks he's very smart. From the viewpoint of Russian citizens who observe this idiocy, he's narrow-minded, egocentrical idiot who tries to earn his own popularity through participation in propaganda farces like this. Here you can see myself. On the right, again, exemplary Soviet bride. On the left, 3 journalists from various countries, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Obviously, they enjoying the situation. They will go back home and write the reports. We were present on a regular Soviet wedding. They were not present on a regular Soviet wedding. They were present. They were part of a farce, of a circus performance. Another thing which I had to sometimes risking my life to explain to foreigners. Time magazine, for example, is very critical of South African racist regime. The whole article was dedicated to the shameful internal passport system where blacks are not allowing to live with whites. For some strange reason, for the last 14 years since my defection, nobody wanted to pay attention to my passport. This is my passport. It also shows my nationality, and it has a police rubber stamp, which is called propiska in Russian language, which assigns me to a certain area of residence. I cannot leave that area, same way as this black man cannot leave the area in South Africa. Yet we call South African government racist regime. Not a single Jane Schmonda or Fonda is brave enough, courageous enough to come to media and say, look, this is what happens in USSR. I send a copy of my passport to many American liberals and civil rights defenders and all the other useful idiots. They never bothered to answer me back. This shows what kind of integrity, what kind of honesty these people are. They're a bunch of hypocrites because they don't want to recognize a good example of racism in my country. This is the first stage of befriending a professor.
Well, that technically wouldn't be racism in your country, Yuri. I mean, just because you were relegated to a certain area within a particular city due to the Soviet Union and their structural formation as a government, that's not racism. It's not exactly the same thing as the South African context. So, his frustration. I'm no fan of Jane Fonda, that's for sure. But him saying, these Western liberals like Jane Fonda won't recognize racism within the Soviet Union. I don't know if the area you're relegated to is due to racism, my man.
You can see myself on the left with the same James Bond smile. On the right is my KGB supervisor, Comrade Leonid Mitrokhin, and in the middle, a professor of political science in Delhi University. The next stage would be to invite him to a gathering of Indo-Soviet Friendship Society. There he is sitting next to his wife before he is being sent to USSR for a free trip. Everything is paid by the Soviet government. He was made to believe that he's invited to USSR because he's a talented, sober-thinking intellectual. Absolutely false. He's invited because he's a useful idiot, because he would agree and subscribe to most of the Soviet propaganda cliché. And when he is coming back to his own country, he's going for years and years to teach the beauties of Soviet socialism to newer and newer generations of his students, thus promoting the Soviet propaganda line. The KGB was even curious about this gentleman. It may look innocent. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, a great spiritual leader, or maybe a great charlatan and crook. depending on from which side you're looking at him.
Definitely a charlatan and crook.
Beatles were trained at his ashram in Hardwar in India how to meditate. Mia Farrow and other useful idiots from Hollywood visited his school, and they returned back to United States absolutely zonked out of their minds with marijuana, hashish, and crazy ideas of meditation. To meditate, in other words, to isolate oneself from the current social and political issues of your own country, to get into your own bubble, to forget about troubles of the world. Obviously, KGB was very fascinated with such a beautiful school, such a brainwashing center for stupid Americans. I was dispatched by the KGB to check what kind of VIP Americans attend this school.
That's you on the left.
Yes, I'm on the left. I was trying to get enrolled in that school. Unfortunately, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi asked too much. He wanted $500 American for enrollment. But my function was not actually to get enrolled in the school. My function was to discover what kind of people from the United States attend this school. And we discovered that, yes, there are some influential members of family, public opinion makers of United States who come back with the crazy stories about Indian philosophy. Indians themselves look upon them as idiots, useful idiots, to say nothing about KGB, who looked at them as extremely naive, misguided people. Obviously, a VIP, say a wife of a congressman or a prominent Hollywood personality, after being trained in that school, is much more instrumental in the hands of manipulators of public opinion and KGB than a normal person who understands, who looks through this type of fake religious training.
Why would they be more susceptible to manipulation?
I just mentioned that because you see, a person who is too much involved in introspective meditation. You see, if you carefully look what Maharishi Mahesh Yogi is teaching to Americans, is that most of the problems, most of the burning issues of today can be solved simply by meditating. Don't rock the boat. Don't get involved. Just sit down, look at your navel, and meditate. And the things, due to some strange logic, due to cosmic vibration, will settle down by themselves. This is exactly what the KGB and Marxist-Leninist propaganda wants from Americans, to distract their opinion, attention, and mental energy from real issues of the United States into a non-issues, into a non-world, non-existent harmony. Obviously, it's more beneficial for the Soviet aggressors to have a bunch of duped Americans than Americans who are self-conscious, healthy, physically fit, and alert to the reality. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi obviously is not on the payroll of the KGB. But whether he knows it or not, he contributes greatly to demoralization of American society. And he's not the only one. There are hundreds of those gurus who come to your country to capitalize on naivete and stupidity of Americans. It's a fashion. It's a fashion to meditate. It's a fashion not to be involved. So obviously, you can see that if KGB were that curious, if they paid my trip to Hardwar, if they assigned me to that strange job, obviously they were very much fascinated. They were convinced that that type of brainwashing is very efficient and instrumental in demoralization of the United States.
Our conversation with Yuri
This picture shows the part of the building of USSR embassy, and my supervisors. On the left is Comrade Mehdi, an Indian communist, and on the right, Comrade Mitrokhin. My supervisors in the secret department of...
Now, I just wanted to reiterate, because we talked about this earlier in the stream, is, you know, the New York Times used Yuri Bezmenov. They wrote an article in 2020. And again, the popularity of Yuri really sort of became exponential during the Trump presidency. And the left, even though, again, he's talking about leftists and meditation and promoting, you know, physical fitness, and he'll even promote becoming Christian and being religious. But the left used this to tie a connection with Russiagate, and that Russia is influencing our political elections, and that Trump was a puppet of Putin. And they actually use Yuri Bezmenov in the interview that we're watching now to establish, again, a theoretical connection to Trump's ascendancy to the presidency, and Yuri Bezmenov talking about Russian influence inside of U.S. politics. So again, as you know, Yuri says things, especially during this last section here, that we're going to agree with, but I'm a little bit skeptical with the fullness of Yuri's narrative. And it's interesting how the left has used Yuri to try to tie some type of connection with Russia involvement in the Trump presidency. So I just wanted to keep all that in mind as we watch the rest of this.
Research and counter-propaganda. It has nothing to do with either research or counter-propaganda. Most of the activity of that department was to compile huge volume of information on individuals who were instrumental in creating public opinion. Publishers, editors, journalists, actors, educationalists, professors of political science, members of parliament, representatives of business circles. Most of these people were divided roughly into groups. Those who would toe the Soviet foreign policy, they would be promoted to the positions of power through media and public opinion manipulation. Those who refused the Soviet influence in their own country would be character assassinated or executed physically come revolution. Same way as in the small town of Hue in South Vietnam, several thousands of Vietnamese were executed in one night when the city was captured by Viet Cong for only 2 days. And American CIA could never figure out how could possibly communists know each individual, where he lives, where to get him, and would be arrested in one night, basically in some 4 hours before dawn, put on a van, taken out of the city limits and shot. The answer is very simple. Long before communists occupied the city, there was extensive network of informers, local Vietnamese citizens, who knew absolutely everything about people who are instrumental in public opinion, including barbers and taxi drivers. Everyone who was sympathetic to the United States was executed. Same thing was done under the guidance of the Soviet embassy in Hanoi, and same thing I was doing in New Delhi. To my horror, I discovered that in the files where people were doomed to execution, there were names of pro-Soviet journalists with whom I was personally friendly.
Pro-Soviet?
Yes. They were idealistically minded leftists who made several visits to USSR, and yet the KGB decided that come revolution or drastic changes in political structure of India, they will have to go.
Why is that?
Because they know too much. Simply because, you see, the useful idiots, the leftists who are idealistically believing in the beauty of Soviet socialist or communist or whatever system, when they get disillusioned, they become the worst enemies. That's why my KGB instructors specifically made a point, never bother with leftists. Forget about these political prostitutes. Aim higher. This was my instruction. Try to get into large circulation, established conservative media. Filthy rich movie makers, intellectuals, so-called academic circles. Cynical, egocentric people who can look into your eyes with angelic expression and tell you a lie. These are the most recruitable people who lack moral principles, who are either too greedy or too suffer from self-importance. They feel that they matter a lot. These are the people who KGB wanted very much to recruit.
But to eliminate the others, to execute the others, don't they serve some purpose? Wouldn't they be the ones you rely on?
They serve purpose only at the stage of destabilization of a nation. For example, your leftists in United States, all these professors and all these beautiful civil rights defenders, they are instrumental in the process of the subversion only to destabilize the nation. When their job is completed, they are not needed anymore. They know too much. Some of them, when they get disillusioned, when they see that Marxist-Leninists come to power, obviously they get offended. They think that they will come to power. The
leftists in our country aren't going to be killed because they know too much. They're going to be killed because having blue-haired transformers isn't actually going to be useful, and so they're just going to be killed because they're a nuisance.
It will never happen, of course. They will be lined up against the wall and shot. But they may turn into the most bitter enemies of Marxist-Leninists when they come to power. And that's what happened in Nicaragua. You remember most of these former Marxist-Leninists were either put to prison or one of them split, and now he's working against Sandinistas. It happened in Grenada when Maurice Bishop was already a Marxist. He was executed by a new Marxist who was more Marxist than this Marxist. Same happened in Afghanistan when first there was Taraki, he was killed by Amin, then Amin was killed by Babrak Karmal with the help of KGB. Same happened in Bangladesh when Mujibur Rahman, very pro-Soviet leftist, was assassinated by his own Marxist-Leninist military comrades. It's the same pattern everywhere. The moment they serve their purpose, all the useful idiots are either be executed entirely, all the idealistically minded Marxists, or exiled or put in prisons, like in Cuba. Many former Marxists are in Cuba, in prison. So most of the Indians who were cooperating with the Soviets, especially without the Department of Information of the USSR embassy, were listed for execution. And when I discovered that fact, of course, I was sick. I was mentally and physically sick. I thought that I'm going to explode one day during the briefing at the ambassador's office. I would stand up and say something that we are basically a bunch of murderers. That's what we are. It has nothing to do with friendship and understanding between the nation and blah, blah, blah. We are murderers. We behave as a bunch of thugs in a country which is hospitable to us, a country which with ancient traditions. But I did not defect. I tried to get the message across. To my horror, nobody wanted even to listen, least of all to believe what I had to say. And I tried all kinds of tricks. I would leak information through letters or lost documents or something like that. And still I got no message. The message was not published, even in the conservative mass media of India. The immediate impulse to defect was Bangladesh crisis, which was described by American correspondents as Islamic grassroots revolution, which is absolute baloney. There was nothing to do with Islam, and there was no grassroots revolution. Actually, there are no grassroots revolutions, period. Any revolution is a byproduct of a highly organized group of conscientious and professional organizers, but has nothing to do with grassroots. In Bangladesh, it was nothing with grassroots. Most of the Awami League party members, Awami League means People's Party, were trained in Moscow in the high party school. Most of the Mukti Fauj leaders, Mukti Fauj in Bengali means People's Army, same as SWAPO and all kind of liberation armies all over the world, the same bunch of useful idiots. They were trained at Lumumba University and various centers of the KGB in Simferopol, in Crimea, and in Tashkent. So when I saw that Indian territory is being used as a jumping board to destroy East Pakistan, I saw myself, thousands of so-called students traveling through India to East Pakistan, through the territory of India, and Indian government pretended not to see what was going on. They knew perfectly well, the Indian police knew it, the intelligence department of the Indian government knew it, the KGB, of course, knew it, and the CIA knew it. That was most infuriating, because when I defected and I explained to the CIA debriefers, they should watch out because East Pakistan is going to erupt any moment. They said I was reading too many James Bond novels. Anyway, so East Pakistan was doomed. One of my colleagues in the Soviet consulate in Calcutta, when he was dead drunk, he ventured into the basement to relieve himself. And he found big boxes which said printed matter to Dhaka University. Dhaka is the capital of East Pakistan. And since he was drunk and curious, he opened one of the boxes and he discovered not printed matter. He discovered Kalashnikov guns and ammunition in there. Anyway, it's a long story. When I saw the preparations for the invasion into East Pakistan, obviously I wanted to defect immediately. The only thing I couldn't at that time make up my mind when and where and how. One of the reasons, of course, you see, I was in love with India. I mentioned it before. I spoke the languages. I socialized with people. And I understood that I had to act fast unless I want this beautiful country to be permanently and irreparably damaged by our presence. One of the reasons not to defect was, as you can see, I was living in relative affluence. Who the hell in a normal mind would defect and do what? To be abused by your media? To be called McCarthyist and fascist and paranoid? Or to drive a taxi in New York City? What for? What the hell for should I?
This is my KGB. You can see my KGB smile here at the pool. My wonderful KGB posture.
To be abused by Americans, to be insulted in exchange for my effort to bring the truthful information about impending danger of subversion. As you can see, I was living in quite comfortable conditions next to swimming pool, where Indians were not allowed, by the way. I was highly paid expert in propaganda. I had my family. I was respected by my nation. My career was cloudless. The third reason, how to defect with the family. To defect with the baby and the wife would be virtual suicide, because according to law, that hypocritical law which I quoted before, the Indian police will have to hand me over back to the KGB, and that will be the end of my defection and probably my life. Again, I cannot smuggle my wife because she was not quite sure what I was doing. She was not that idealistically involved, and she was definitely not in the total picture of what I was doing for the KGB. She would be shocked if I put her in my van and drive her to American embassy or elsewhere. That would be a greatest danger. So again, I had to defect in such a way that my defection would look as simple disappearance. And there were many cases like that when the Soviet agents simply disappeared, either killed in action or, thanks to their curiosity and their close contacts with radicals, some of them were killed by the Marxists, by the way. It happened in many African countries when the Soviet KGB were killed by Africans themselves, not because they hated Marxist-Leninism, but because they were simply trigger-happy bunch of unruly characters. If you give them a machine gun, they will shoot. And some of the Soviets obviously were not careful enough to protect themselves, and they got into embarrassing situations when they were shot at the crossfire between factions of so-called liberation movements. Anyway, so I decided, as I said, to study the counterculture. I decided this probably would be the best way to disappear. I socialized with characters like this on the left. You see, he's a barefoot American hippie. It took me quite a long time to study exactly what they were doing and how to mix with them. But eventually I did it. Most of Indian newspapers carried my picture and promise of 2,000 rupees for information about my whereabouts. But they were looking for the wrong person, because they obviously tried to stop a young Soviet diplomat in white shirt and tie, and this is how I looked at the time of defection. Nobody could possibly think that the Soviet diplomat would be as crazy as to join a bunch of hippies.
That's you.
Yes, travel India and smoke hash. So I made it literally almost like a Hollywood-style detective story. From under the nose of the KGB in Bombay airport, I landed the plane and I flew to Greece, where I was debriefed by the CIA. That's basically that's all for my slides.
We can turn off the projector, and that's very interesting. Well, you spoke several times before about ideological subversion. That is a phrase that I'm afraid some Americans don't fully understand. When the Soviets use the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the process which is legitimate, overt, and open. You can see it with your own eyes. All you have to do, all American mass media has to do, is to unplug their bananas from their ears, open up their eyes, and they can see it. There's no mystery. There's nothing to do with espionage. I know that espionage intelligence gathering looks more romantic. It sells more deodorants through the advertising, probably. That's why your Hollywood producers are so crazy about James Bond type of thrillers. But in reality, the main emphasis of the KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process, which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process, which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate 1 generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see. Most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior.
And this is where, again, we would agree with him. We can just look at the coup and the year 2020, and again, the entire meme of the NPC, and agree with him. And to an extent, although in 1984, it certainly was not as bad as it is in the 21st century, but many of the countercultural revolutionaries here in the U.S. did begin to occupy centers of power, whether it be politics or university professors or higher level managerial class, CEO type bureaucratic structures, stuff like that. So I agree that these people now have sort of infiltrated the entire system, but I wanted to point out that the problem with Yuri is that his solution is just Western liberalism, but Western liberalism has created the same NPCs that he's warning about, and the propaganda in the United States. He acts as if the CIA, who he debriefed with for 6 months in Athens, Greece, wasn't also interested in propaganda, kind of like aspects of his story. And again, there's murky elements. We've already discussed that, but it's not almost another form of propaganda. And it lays further claims that somehow, our CIA and the FBI, they're all the good guys and they're fighting the evil Soviets. And I'm not here to support the Soviet Union or communism. You guys who know me know that I don't support that stuff, but it's just interesting, right? Because the things he's warning about, the NPC of today, the person who believes all the propaganda, the Howard Sterns of the world, right? Who doesn't leave their basement for 4 years, gets all their boosters. And he said he's left once to go see his mother, his elderly mother. And I saw an audio today. I made sure to wear my mask, and yet somehow I still got COVID. oh, dude, you're an idiot. But again, you can see he's also a leftist. So this is where I think we could certainly agree with Yuri in many regards. Oh, we got a super chat that came in. Shout out to MyTech23. Throws in a super chat. Thank you so much, MyTech23, for the support. Throws in $5 and says, in Soviet Russia, kindergarten playground swings you. Yeah, exactly. He's MyTech23 is referring to the slideshow there, and he talked about the kindergarten in Siberia, and that this was the place where the children were basically imprisoned and had to play while the the detractors of the state were in the gulag. And I'm sure to some degree that is true, but again, after 2020, I think somebody in the chat made a great point. You think our kindergartens were worse when we were forcing kids to mask? And remember the videos of the kids crying because they'd pull it below their nose, and the crazy kindergarten teachers would freak out and force it above their nose, like, I can't breathe. I don't think we're doing much better on this side of the Atlantic, just saying. But anyways, continuing here, because again, remember that for Yuri, his whole thing about the 4 stages of ideological subversion, which he's getting ready to lay out, is demoralization, which has to do with the eroding of the moral and ethical structure of the country, which again, we can agree with Yuri that there's been a total demoralization in the United States, and the rampancy of degeneracy is certainly part and parcel of that. Even having Joe Biden as our head of state, that's a form of psychological warfare and demoralization, because we know that Joe Biden doesn't do anything, and that it's the deep state actors, it's the bureaucratic structure, it's the people that have always been there. They're the ones that are pulling the strings, and it's just another way to demoralize the country. Stage 2 is destabilization. He talks about economic unrest, of which, in a way, we can see that that's certainly on the horizon right now. When the dollar collapses, who knows? That's still certainly up in the air. Third stage is crisis, calling internal violence. And remember our summer of love, 2020, after St. George Floyd passed away, that we saw this. We saw all the outpouring of love and caring for society by burning down people's neighborhoods, burning down people's houses. And then stage 4 is the normalization of it. So when he's getting ready to get into the 4 stages of ideological subversion, it's demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and then normalization.
In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid of society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who would be acting in favor and in the interests of the United States society.
And yet these people have been programmed and, as you say, in place, and who are favorable to an opening with the Soviet concept. These are the very people who would be marked for extermination in this country?
Most of them, yes. Simply because the psychological shock when they will see in future what the beautiful society of equality and social justice means in practice, obviously they will revolt. They will be very unhappy, frustrated people. And the Marxist-Leninist regime does not tolerate these people. They will join the links of dissenters, dissidents. Unlike in present United States, there will be no place for dissent in future Marxist-Leninist America. Here you can get popular like Daniel Ellsberg and filthy rich like Jane Fonda for being dissident, for criticizing your Pentagon. In future, these people will be simply squashed like cockroaches. Nobody's going to pay them nothing for their beautiful, noble ideas of equality. This they don't understand, and it will be greatest shock for them, of course. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already for the last 25 years. Actually, it's overfulfilled because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization. So basically, America is stuck. with demoralization. And unless, even if you start right now, here, this minute, you start educating new generation of Americans, it will still take you 15 to 20 years to turn the tide of ideological perception of reality back to normalcy and patriotism. The next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby, it doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation. It's what matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. And you can see it quite clearly that in some areas, in such sensitive areas as defense and economy, the influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. I could never believe it 14 years ago when I landed in this part of the world that the process will go that fast. The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country to the verge of crisis. You can see it in Central America now. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. Normalization is a cynical expression borrowed from Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet tanks moved into Czechoslovakia in '68, Comrade Brezhnev said, now the situation in brotherly Czechoslovakia is normalized. This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kinds of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., with benevolent dictators like Walter Mondale, who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfillable or not. He will go to Moscow to kiss the bottoms of new generation of Soviet assassins. Never mind. He will create false illusions that the situation is under control. Situation is not under control. Situation is disgustingly out of control. Most of the American politicians, media, and educational system trains another generation of people who think they are living at a peacetime. False. The United States is in a state of war, undeclared total war against the basic principles and the foundations of this system. And the initiator of this war is not Comrade Andropov, of course.
And certainly we can agree with many of those ideas. I mean, our system now, the U.S. government, I mean, we know that our elections are fraudulent. We do live in a total upside down world, and our system is more corrupt than anything going on in Russia at this point. So, you know, him talking about that eventually the communist ideals will make their way to America. Well, this was stated by Orthodox Christians. You know, Father Sarah from Rose said first in Russia, then tomorrow in America. I mean, this is today. We have the communist ideals present. We're led by these people that are bureaucrats and want centralized structures. So to this point, I totally agree with Yuri. And again, him talking about it in the 90s is nowhere near as bad as it is now in the 21st century. We had a super chat come in over on the Streamlabs by Gary. Throws in a generous $25. Thank you so much, Gary. I really appreciate that, my man. Thank you for all your support. God bless you. And again, just thanks for all the support over the streams, man. I really appreciate that. So we're almost finished here with this interview. This is where the points where Yuri makes that I think we can all agree with. Whether, again, however, how high level he was in the KGB, as we've said, potentially skeptical on that. How exactly he made his way to Canada and then eventually to the United States. Seems to be contrasting narratives there. The fact that he's been married 3 times, unfortunately left all 3 women with children. Certainly that might be a character flaw. And then, of course, his alcoholism led to his downfall during this period in the 1980s, which is ironic because he talked about his use of alcohol during these meetings, these various meetings when he was a KGB agent in India to try to get these people liquored up so they didn't know what they're doing. You know, it is a bit ironic that it was alcohol that sort of brought him down as well. So unfortunate there. But this last few sections here, this is where I think we can really agree with aspects of what Yuri Bezmenov is talking about and why he's been claimed to be a prophet and has described the sort of present state of 21st century America.
It's the system. However ridiculous it may sound, the world communist system or the world communist conspiracy, whether I scare some people or not, I don't give a hoot. If you are not scared by now, nothing can scare you. But you don't have to be paranoid about it. What actually happens now, that unlike myself, you have literally several years to live on unless the United States wake up. The time bomb is ticking, that every second the disaster is coming closer and closer. Unlike myself, you will have nowhere to defect to unless you want to live in Antarctica with penguins. This is it. This is the last country of freedom and possibility.
Okay, so what do we do? What is your recommendation to the American people?
Well,
I just want to highlight, I just saw the two. Thank you, Daniel Flores, for reminding me I needed to move to the next page. I totally missed it. I was looking at the wrong page. Daniel Flores throws in $5, says, I appreciate all the content you provide. Thank you and God bless. Thank you so much, Daniel. I appreciate you, brother. Thank you very much. And Romero said, God bless, comrade. Well, thank you very much, Romero, with the $10 super chat. I truly appreciate that. And I missed some streams because, again, Dono Chat got changed. So I missed a few super chats from the other day. I just want to read those out. Pork Stuff said, blown away by your growth and output. Keep up the good work. Thank you so much, Pork Stuff. I apologize for missing that the other day. And Blue Skittle said, it's so over the target. Thank you so much, Blue Skittle. And then Heidi sent in a generous super chat yesterday, said, this is incredibly good, and I missed the first hour. Thank you. Well, thank you, Heidi, for your super chats yesterday. And again, major thank you to Daniel Flores and Romeo, and then Gary for the super chats. Again, if you want to show some love for the stream, feel free to send it in over on Dono Chat, Streamlabs, or YouTube. So thank you all so much for the support. I apologize for missing those. Okay.
The immediate thing that comes to my mind is, of course, there must be a very strong national effort to educate people in the spirit of real patriotism, number one. Number two, to explain them the real danger of socialist, communist, whatever, welfare state, big brother government. If people will fail to grasp the impending danger of that development, nothing ever can help United States. You may kiss goodbye to your freedom, including freedoms to homosexuals, to prison inmate. All this freedom will vanish, evaporate in 5 seconds, including your precious lives. The second thing, the moment at least part of the United States population is convinced that the danger is real, they have to force their government. And I'm not talking about sending letters, signing petitions, and all this beautiful, noble activity. I'm talking about forcing the United States government to stop aiding communism. Because there is no other problem more burning and urgent than to stop the Soviet military-industrial complex from destroying whatever is left of the free world. And it is very easy to do. No credits, no technology, no money, no political or diplomatic recognition, and of course, no such idiocy as grain deals to USSR. The Soviet people, 270 million of Soviets, will be eternally thankful to you if you stop aiding a bunch of murderers who sit now in Kremlin and whom President Reagan respectfully calls government. They do not govern anything, least of all such complexity as the Soviet economy. So basic, two very simple, maybe too simplistic answers or solutions, but nevertheless, they are the only solutions. Educate yourself, understand what's going on around you. You are not living at the time of peace. You are in a state of war, and you have precious little time to save yourself. You don't have much time, especially if you are talking about young generation. There's not much time left for convulsions to the beautiful disco music.
You know what's interesting, again, watching this discussion in 1984, and even though, again, we may have some problems with Yuri, certainly what the phenomenon he's describing was happening. And to think that, again, whatever you believe in regards to Trump and his efficacy as president, again, fair enough there. But what we're about to see, again, in this 2024 may be the very last year we have any sort of hope at an oppositional force, no matter what you think that may be. And so, you know, it's interesting, right? Because this is essentially 40 years ago, and now 40 years forward, we're seeing the fruits of many of these ideas flourishing, and the fact that our government structure and the propaganda that our country has been inundated with for so many years, that, you know, look where it's at. We have half the country that thinks, you know, a surgical mask saves them from a virus, and that, Joe Biden's going to, help them with their future and that men can get pregnant. And I mean, wild, wild times.
Very soon it will go, just overnight. If we are talking about capitalists or wealthy businessmen, I think they are selling the rope on which they will hang very soon. If they don't stop, if they cannot curb their unsettled desire for profit, and if they keep on trading with the monster of the Soviet communism, they are going to hang very soon. And they will pray to be killed, but unfortunately they will be sent to Alaska probably to manage industry of slaves. It's simplistic. I know it sounds unpleasant.
Yeah, Kit's a great point. Shout out to Kit. He says it's not that he was wrong, because he wasn't. That's my point earlier, is that there's so much of Yuri that we would agree with. It's that he had new masters and he colored in the lines. Exactly. That's exactly it. And those new lines was just the promotion of Western liberalism, which, again, as we see 40 years later, has led to the same point, which, again, he was warning about, but his masters led him toward the same direction, unfortunately. So
I know Americans don't like to listen to things which are unpleasant, but I have defected not to tell you the stories about such idiocies as microfilm, James Bond type espionage. This is garbage. You don't need any espionage anymore. I have come to talk about survival. It's a question of survival of this system. You may ask me, what is it in for me? Survival, obviously, because as I said, I am now in your boat. If we sing together, we'll sing beautifully together. There is no other place on this planet to defect to.
And so that wraps up our conversation in regards to Yuri Bezmenov. We got a super chat that came in by John Anon. Throws in $10. Thank you very much, John Anon. He says, have you ever done a deep dive on the QAnon movement in terms of who was actually behind it, who benefited, and how it was implemented? How did exposing satanic pedophiles work as a psyop? Well, if you're going to ask my particular opinion, no, I've not done a stream or a deep dive into that. I think I would share the same opinion as many people who have been very questionable of QAnon. I was questioning it when it was at its height. I remember first discovering about the QAnon phenomenon when I was still living in Berkeley, California, and I saw some of the truther sphere really going on about Q. And my general thoughts is it was the intelligence agencies of the United States created the QAnon phenomenon to basically co-opt and corrupt various patriot truther movements. And so you can look at J6, and I think without the Q phenomenon, aspects of it. Now, again, that's very complicated because it wasn't like it was all Q people out there, and we had a real rigged election, unfortunately, that was a real catalyst for people to trying to get like real answers to stuff. But I think promising these, that Q was behind it, that the white hats were working on it, because I'm seeing a reviving of Q on X right now. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, those of you who are on X, that I've been seeing all these huge like Trump accounts like going back into Q, and look, Trump had his white hat on. He has a white MAGA hat now. See, this is talking about how the white hats are in control, and I've been seeing so many people that believe that he's still the real president and that there's an acting. I mean, I think what the point was to cause confusion and manipulation of the MAGA movement by saying that they were going to solve some of these pedo stuff. Again, Epstein was coming out around that time. And so it was a way to get false hope. It was a way to get people to believe in a fake narrative. And I think it was really effective. I'm blown away by the amount of people who still believe some of these Q postings that I see on X. Who was behind it? I believe it was the U.S., the deep state intelligence agencies. I think that it was totally manipulated from the get-go. I think that's how they were able to, provide little cues. I'm not talking about Q itself, but cues in regards to, he's going to wear XYZ, or he's going to go at this place and say this. Well, again, some of these intelligence, they already knew his schedule. They may have already known where he was going to go. They already know what speech he said. So when he's going to come out public, they can put these little Q postings together. So my belief is that who benefited Well, the opposition benefited because it was able to manipulate people. The deep state benefited, if you want to call it. The globalists benefited because it made MAGA supporters at the end of it look like idiots. They were manipulated. They were posting stuff. Again, Q was used to make Marjorie Taylor Greene look like an idiot because she believed some of it at some point, and then she eventually renounced it. So I think it was a way to totally taint people of that movement, to get them to believe with something and then identify with it. Because then if you were the intelligence agency that were providing that psyop, I mean, mission complete. You totally did a bang up job of getting all these people. And in a way, it led to worship of Trump. And I think a detrimental way, because the Q people aren't able to accurately criticize aspects like Operation Warp Speed, like, some of the shortcomings of his administration, like his failure to hire competent people. He's gonna drain the swamp, and yet he continued to hire the swamp. Now, I know some people say, well, he didn't know at that point. The people around him were misleading him. Yes, thank you. Those type of cues, exactly, Kit. But I hope, again, it's hard to know what's going on. Certainly all the lawsuits, some people have like higher level perceptions that really the deep state, the reason why they're doing all these lawsuits is to get Trump back in office, because they know it's going to galvanize more support. I don't know. It looks to me, again, when we had the Collins brothers on the other day, it looks to me like the system that is flailing a bit. The system, the globalist system that was behind the coup, that was behind the gain of function research, that was behind mail-in ballots, that was behind Ukraine, NATO alliance. It seems like they're kind of floundering. Again, I have my own beefs with Trump as a person and as his efficacy as a president, but it seems like there's a legitimate tension between the state and Trump. Now, I may be seeing this wrong. You guys can let me know what you see. But to me, Q was a fantastic psyop by the deep state to get Trump supporters and people that were true patriots to basically look like fools, and also put hope. They weren't as active and actually pushing Trump to do the things you said he'd do, because, oh, don't worry, they're in control. It's going to work out. Oh yeah. Trump's not going to, he's not going to let Biden become president, even though, again, the election was, what are you guys talking about? You're letting yourself totally be overrun by this false hope. I didn't get it. So just to sum up, John Anon, I've never done a deep dive. Maybe that'd be an interesting topic into the future. But I think, talking about the pedos, I think that was just a way to sprinkle a little bit of truth, just like the evil one does. We put a little bit of truth in it to get people to bite the poison apple. And so that's kind of my opinion, but you guys let me know what you think. Also, we got a super chat that comes in from Bonsai Jungle, throws in $10. Thank you so much, Bonsai Jungle. He says, probably Alexandra has a good video relating to this Q on Odyssey. Hegelian dialectic. Have you ever seen her videos? No, I've never seen her videos, but exactly. It's another Hegelian dialectic, but a dialectic that they actually control. I know some people think Trump is a Hegelian dialectic. Maybe. Maybe he seems like, again, for all his shortcomings and all his ineffectiveness in office, that he is not part of the system. What was really interesting is to see how the media, especially when the Epstein files dropped, how they kept wanting to put Trump there as, he went to Epstein, but they wouldn't talk about all the other people that is on their side, which makes you think, okay, maybe something's going on there. I don't know the details. From my understanding, his name was on the flight logs. He was never at the island. I don't know. Certainly he likes women. I know that much. But I've not seen probably Alexandra and her video, but I assume Q absolutely was a false Hegelian dialectic. But the difference between having like a Bush and a Al Gore as a false dialectic, I think Trump wasn't maybe fully controlled, even though the people around him were certainly part of the false dialectic. They were controlled, and he kept hiring people from this sort of entourage. But the Q phenomenon creates a controlled dialectic where they can control both sides. So that's kind of my take on it, Bonsai Jungle. I think that I'll check her videos out, but I don't know what her video says, but I generally agree with that. It's another false dialectic, and the Q phenomenon was another form of manipulation by the deep state. So that's kind of where my head goes with all that stuff. I don't know what your guys' general thoughts are on that. So I'm just trying to just look at what some of the chat says. Yeah, the Bush Kerry electromania. Yeah. I mean, that's a false dialectic. We know how many of the previous elections were false dialectics. You know, McCain versus Obama, false dialectic, right? It seems like Trump maybe isn't fully controlled. Now, you can certainly question his depth of understanding. You can certainly question his ineffectiveness in firing Fauci, Operation Warp Speed, border control, building the wall. They built a wall that had bars in it that we've seen now people are getting through. So, you know, I think there's a lot going on there. Pim says Jim Corsi said to have contacts with QAnon, and then he was investigated by Mueller and he flipped. Oh, interesting. So that's really interesting. Pim, thanks for sharing that, brother. That makes a lot of sense to me. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Thomas says uniparty politics. That's all we have, you know, and Thomas, I feel bad for Canada. Canada's in a dire state at this point, you know, with the imprisoning, you know, jailing journalists. They jailed the what was the guy? Isn't he Russian? I know he's Slavic of some sort. He's a Protestant pastor, but they put him in jail just for going to church during the lockdowns. I mean, Canada, the trucker convoy, locking bank accounts. I mean, I don't know if Canada has a true opposition party. Again, I just don't know that much about Canadian politics. I get a little bit, you know, south of the border here. And it seems like Trump might not be part of the system, and that's why it's flailing so hard. But, you know, I don't know what the system's going to do with this election in 2024, because what we just saw the other night with Iowa is there is so much momentum behind Trump right now. I mean, what exactly can they do? How are they going to slow that down? I don't know if they can. Now, I agree with people who've speculated the goal is with Nikki Haley. And so the left or the deep state doesn't think that they could run a leftist candidate and beat Trump at this point. So the goal, and this is what I generally believe too, the goal is to run Nikki Haley in these open primaries. So New Hampshire is getting ready to be the next one, which is an open primary, meaning that the people that are registered as Democratic voters in New Hampshire can go vote for the Republican nominee. And so they're going to turn out. And if you look at some of the polls, not that polls mean anything again, and whatever you see on the news is probably fake, but let's just speculate. Maybe the polls are somewhat accurate. Well, Nikki is way ahead of DeSantis in New Hampshire. And there was a guy on Fox News. He was being interviewed by Neil Cavuto. I saw it on X, and Neil Cavuto is another one of these fake conservative, you know, talking heads. But the guy that he was interviewing basically totally let the cat out of the bag and was like, oh yeah, I'm voting for Nikki Haley. I love Nikki. And he's like, you know, what's interesting is I'm going to a really big donor party at this, this millionaire's apartment in New York City. And I'll tell you what, it's so funny because he's a lifelong Democrat. In fact, he's one of the largest donors to the Democratic Party. And what we figure is that, you know, we can't really vote for a Democrat, so we're going to vote for, this is on Fox News. The dudes just start laying out like all this money that Nikki's about to get by all these Democratic donors, because California is an open primary. I think most of the blue states are open primaries. And the reason why that's important is that all these Democrats are going to be able to go vote, and Nikki Haley may win some of these states. Who knows? And so that might be their goal, is that Nikki Haley is going to have a fighting chance at the end of this, Republican nominee, primary, because she's going to win all these open open primaries, and that Democrat voters are just going to turn out in mass. That may be what happens. I don't know. And they hope that something's going to happen with Trump and he won't be on the ballot. And if that's the case, if Nikki Haley's still in it and Ron DeSantis has already dropped out, we know that Ramaswamy's now basically with the Trump campaign. She's going to be the last person left, and she's going to be the Republican nominee. And therefore, again, it's back to a controlled dialectic. Kit says there's huge shortcomings we're all aware of in his administration. I pushed all my chips in 2016 that he would make a move, and he left a lot of people out to dry. But yeah, I mean, in a sense, that I agree with you. At the same time, there's really no other option. I mean, DeSantis, I've totally lost trust in DeSantis. He flipped on the Ukraine Russian saga due to a major donor, Zionist donor. You can put the dots together there, and flipped on that, was then in favor of funding Ukraine to defend their country and their borders. He flipped on the J6ers and basically said they were unpatriotic. He flipped then on the 2020 election and said that it was legitimate. And he's also passing legislation in Florida regarding hate speech. Now, there's also really good things. For example, the attorney or the Surgeon General in Florida, the African American doctor, or no, he's not African American. He's from Nigeria. He's a Nigerian American. Now, he's really good when he's talking about the jibby jabs and what's in them and the health problems that are coming from them. So it's like DeSantis, it did good things, but really at this point, it makes you think that DeSantis was almost another false opposition that allowed for the pressure to be released, right? So Florida then became this, conservative safe haven, and they enacted all these policies, and it was just a way to let the pressure valve open. And then him as a person, he seems really sort of robotic. He seems kind of unlikable in ways. I don't know. There's just something there that's kind of off. So I think it's going to be Haley and Trump. And I think the goal of the deep state right now is to make sure Haley's the Republican nominee. So that's kind of my general opinion there. So you guys let me know what you think about that. Greenland said they've been pretty in your face about the IDT. There's anything they wouldn't try. I mean, last time we, quote, stopped counting for the night, and lo and behold, 81 million with one of 18 bellwether counties. Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with you. And that's the thing, that all the conservatives in the government, they haven't even done anything to safeguard the elections. So that's the thing where they could just steal it again. That's where, disease X is now out. I don't know if you guys saw in Davos, the World Economic Forum is talking about disease X, this 100% fatal disease coming out of China. It seems like it's perfect timing, right? We're right in the middle of January. The lockdowns began in March. It seems like things are lining up. You ask me. We got a super chat that came in over on the Streamlabs. It is by Alt Monarchist, throws in $10. Thank you so much, Alt Monarchist. He says, Yuri failed to mention that Great Britain, Western Germany, France, Spain, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Canada, Denmark, and other countries were great places to defect in 1984, not just the USA. True. And that's where Glitzen, I think, defected to Helsinki in Finland. So, yeah, that's another great point. I totally agree with you. And Yuri said stuff that I certainly agree with, but Yuri also, there's some real question marks in regards to the validity of some of his overall story. Maybe it's all true. Maybe he was telling the truth about the whole thing. Certainly we can agree about the ideological subversion, active measures, psychological warfare, all that stuff, because we can see it. It says DeSantis was always in the wrong camp. Red flags waved even in spring 2020. or in spring, 2020. I agree. I think he was good at being one of the first governors to kind of push back, but you almost think now how easy he flips on issues based on his donors' advice. You almost feel that he was told to do and enact the policies that he enacted in Florida so that they could try to set him up for this presidential run. I could be wrong. Yeah, he's playing the uniparty game. Exactly. I totally agree with DeSantis there. I liked Ramaswamy, but I also don't trust him. I mean, he made money off the jibby jabs. He got very wealthy from some of his medical ventures. And he was very much in favor of the jibby jab and the mask mandates when those were issued. But again, I don't know his intentions. I don't know his heart. I certainly agree with a lot of the rhetoric coming out of Ramaswamy lately. But I don't know if I would want my president to be a Hindu, me personally. I think I would still prefer them, at least even with Trump, at least if it's just lip service, I would prefer him to be a Christian. So anyways, guys, that looks like all of it. I'm going to, again, give a special thank you to all the supporters. Thank you, Tag Hua. Thank you, MyTech23. Thank you, John Anon. Thank you, the Bonsai Jungle. Over on Dono Chat, thank you, Romeo. Thank you, Daniel Flares. Thank you, Heidi. I didn't get to thank you yesterday. And then from the stream with the Collins brothers, thank you very much, Pork Stuff. And thank you, Blue Skittle. If you guys see this, again, I apologize. Dono Chat, they restructured how it works. And so now they moved to different pages. It used to be you just stay on the same page, refresh it, and then they would emerge. So I apologize for missing that Pork Stuff and Blue Skittle, but thank you guys so much for your stream or your support during the Collins Brothers stream. But that's going to do it for me, guys. I will be back. The next stream I have lined up is we're going to be talking about AI robots and the incel phenomenon. I hope to do that Sunday. I also want to give a special thank you to Alt Monarchist and Gary. Major thank you to Gary for your generous super chat. And so I will be back Sunday doing a deep dive on robot girlfriends, AI girlfriends, and the incel phenomenon, and kind of tying a string around that whole topic. So I will see you all then. I appreciate you guys. I love you guys. Thank you for all the support. I truly appreciate it. And as always, until next time, God bless.